The road to Black Hollow was as empty as the town itself. Miles of cracked asphalt stretched ahead of us, bordered by gnarled trees that clawed at the overcast sky. The shadows between the branches seemed to shift as we drove, forming shapes that disappeared when I tried to focus on them. Even in daylight, the air felt heavier here, as if the town had been forgotten by time and by the sun. The silence in the car was suffocating. We'd run out of words hours ago, or maybe none of us wanted to say what we were really thinking. Danny's death hadn't made sense, and the few details we had only deepened the unease that had been gnawing at me since the moment we got the call. Found in the old church, alone, with injuries no one could explain. The official report had ruled it as an accident, but we knew Danny, and nothing about it felt right. The town came into view suddenly, as if it had been waiting for us. The houses, once quaint and familiar, now looked hollow, their windows dark and unwelcoming. The air grew colder as we passed through the center of town, and I caught glimpses of people watching us from behind drawn curtains. Their faces were pale, their expressions blank, but there was something in their eyes, something that sent a shiver crawling down my spine. We reached the church just before dusk. The building loomed at the edge of the forest, its white paint long since peeled away, leaving the wood beneath weathered and gray. The steeple leaned precariously to one side, and the broken windows stared down at us like empty eyes. My chest tightened as we climbed out of the car. I didn't want to be here, but I couldn't leave. Something had drawn us back, something stronger than fear. The heavy wooden doors groaned in protest as we pushed them open, revealing a cavernous interior bathed in dim light. Dust hung in the air, catching the fading rays of sunlight that filtered through the shattered stained glass. The pews were lined with scratches, deep gouges that ran the length of the wood, as if something had tried to claw its way out. A chill ran down my spine as I stepped inside, the air colder than it had any right to be. We moved deeper into the church, our footsteps echoing off the warped floorboards. The altar at the far end was draped in a tattered cloth, and I could see the outline of something beneath it. My stomach churned as I approached, the air growing heavier with each step. The cloth had been white once, but now it was stained with dark, rust-colored patches that trailed down to the floor. I didn't need to lift it to know what I'd find beneath. Danny had died here. I could feel it. The room grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, the faint light from the windows fading into shadow. I reached for my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the room. That's when I saw them, markings carved into the walls, intricate symbols that spiraled and twisted in ways that made my head ache. They covered every surface, overlapping and intertwining like a language too ancient to understand. The air grew colder still, and I could hear it then, a faint sound, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. A whisper, low and guttural, coming from the shadows that pooled at the edges of the room. My flashlight flickered, and the sound grew louder, spreading through the church like a wave. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, overlapping and indistinct, their words a tangled cacophony that made my chest tighten. The door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang, and the whispers stopped. The sudden silence was worse, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed against my chest. I turned toward the others, but their faces were pale, their eyes wide with fear as they stared at something behind me. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what they saw. But something in the air, a cold, searing presence, forced me to turn. At first I thought it was a shadow, a trick of the fading light. But it moved, shifting against the far wall like smoke given form. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs too long and its movements too smooth. Its face, or where its face should have been, was a void, an absence that seemed to pull the light into it. My flashlight flickered again, and I realized it wasn't a trick. It was real. The room seemed to shrink around us, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as the thing stepped closer. It didn't walk. It glided, its movements too fluid, too unnatural. My flashlight went out completely, plunging us into darkness. The whispers returned, louder now, almost deafening, and I could feel them crawling into my mind, pulling at my thoughts, unraveling them. A scream tore through the darkness, high and panicked, and I realized it was mine. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held us in place, and I stumbled backward, my hands grasping for anything to steady myself. I tripped over one of the pews, hitting the floor hard, the breath knocked from my lungs. The whispers stopped again, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like the air itself had been sucked from the room. When I opened my eyes, the thing was gone. The room was still dark, the air cold and heavy, but the presence had lifted. I turned toward the others, their faces pale, and their breaths coming in sharp, shallow gasps. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Whatever we had come here to find, it wasn't the truth. It was something far worse. The night outside the church was suffocating, the kind of darkness that felt alive, wrapping itself around us like a shroud. The forest loomed just beyond the edge of the clearing, its tangled branches twisting together into shapes I didn't want to acknowledge. The air was heavy, cold, and damp, thick with the kind of silence that wasn't empty but waiting. None of us spoke as we made our way back to the car. The crunch of our footsteps on the gravel path seemed too loud, each step echoing into the void. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the weak beam barely cutting through the night. Every shadow felt like it could move, every rustle of leaves like a breath at the back of my neck. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us out of that church. When we reached the car, Olivia tried the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. She yanked it again, harder this time, the sound of her breathing sharp in the cold air. "It's locked," she muttered, her voice thin and strained, more to herself than to any of us. She fumbled for the keys, her hands shaking, but when she finally managed to unlock it, something felt wrong. The headlights flickered on, cutting through the darkness in a brief, blinding flash. I flinched, my heart pounding as the light illuminated the tree line. For a split second, I thought I saw something there, something tall and thin, standing just beyond the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. And I told myself it was just my imagination. We piled into the car in silence, and Ethan turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, groaned, and then died. He tried again, his jaw clenched tight, but the car refused to start. The headlights dimmed, the dashboard flickering weakly before going dark. The silence in the car was heavier than the one outside, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "We need to leave," Brooke whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. No one argued. Ethan slammed his fist against the steering wheel in frustration before shoving the door open and stepping out. His flashlight beams swept across the clearing, and I followed him, my legs shaking with every step. We didn't have a choice but to walk. The road back to town stretched through the forest, a narrow strip of asphalt swallowed by the trees. The flashlight beams bounced and wavered as we moved, the darkness pressing in closer with every step. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look into the shadows, but the feeling of being watched was constant, an itch at the back of my skull that I couldn't ignore. The first sound came from somewhere to our left, a faint rustling, like leaves being disturbed. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat, and turned toward the noise. The others stopped too, their flashlights darting through the trees. "Probably just an animal," Ethan muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. The rustling came again, louder this time, closer. My pulse quickened, and I gripped my flashlight tighter, the beam shaking as I swept it across the forest. The shadows seemed to shift and ripple, but I couldn't see anything. The air felt colder now, each breath clouding in front of me in faint puffs of mist. And then we heard it, a low, guttural sound, like the growl of something that didn't belong in this world. It came from deeper in the forest, but it echoed in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. I felt the blood drain from my face as the growl was followed by a series of sharp, snapping sounds, like twigs being crushed underfoot. "Move," Olivia said, her voice tight with fear. We started walking faster, our footsteps crunching on the gravel in a frantic rhythm. The growl came again, closer now, and I could feel it vibrating in my chest. The rustling in the trees grew louder, and I could hear something, multiple somethings, moving through the underbrush, circling us. My flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a split second before surging back to life. In that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing among the trees. Its limbs were long and angular, its body twisted in ways that made my stomach churn. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, like a pressure bearing down on me from all sides. "Run!" Brooke's voice shattered the silence, and we took off, our footsteps pounding against the gravel as we sprinted down the road. The forest blurred around me, the trees twisting and shifting in the corner of my vision. I didn't dare look back. The sound of snapping branches and heavy footsteps chased us, growing louder and closer with every second. The road seemed endless, stretching out in front of us like a nightmare. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. The growls were deafening now, echoing through the forest in a cacophony of sound that made my head spin. I stumbled, nearly falling, but Olivia grabbed my arm, pulling me back to my feet. When we finally broke through the tree line, the sight of the dim lights of the town ahead almost didn't feel real. We didn't stop running until we reached the first house, collapsing onto the porch in a heap. My chest heaved as I gasped for air, my heart threatening to burst out of my chest. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of our ragged breathing. I looked back toward the forest, half expecting to see something emerge from the darkness. But there was nothing there. The trees were still, their shadows long and unbroken in the faint glow of the streetlights. The growls, the footsteps, the whispers, they were gone. But the feeling of being watched hadn't left. It clung to me like a second skin, and I knew, deep down, that whatever was out there wasn't finished with us. The air in the town felt heavier now, as if whatever we'd disturbed in the woods had followed us here, seeping into the cracked sidewalks and faded storefronts. The lights lining the streets flickered weakly, casting long shadows that twisted and stretched in ways that didn't feel natural. It wasn't just the forest anymore. It was the entire town. Something was wrong. Something deeper than I could explain. And yet, none of us dared to speak about it. Not yet. We ended up back at Danny's house, though calling it a refuge felt like a cruel joke. The old, creaking structure felt too big, its dark hallways yawning like a hungry maw. Dust coated every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew and abandonment. Danny's parents had left town years ago, and the house had been sitting empty ever since. It should have felt like just another old building, but instead, it felt alive. Ethan lit a single candle and set it on the coffee table in the middle of the living room. The faint, flickering light only made the shadows worse. They crawled up the walls and pooled in the corners, moving as if they had a will of their own. I tried not to look at them, but it was impossible to ignore the feeling that they were looking back. Brooke broke the silence first, her voice sharp and trembling. "We can't stay here. That thing, it's out there. It's not going to stop." Her words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, but the memory of the figure in the woods, of its long, twisted limbs and empty face, was burned into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was right. We weren't safe. Not here. Not anywhere. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, his jaw clenched tight. "We need answers," he said finally, his voice low and steady, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Danny. He must have known something. Why else would he go into that church? The mention of Danny sent a cold spike through my chest. His death had never made sense, not the location, Not the injuries, not the strange markings I'd found on the walls. And now, with everything that had happened, it felt like more than a coincidence. It felt like a warning. We agreed to search the house, hoping, desperately, that Danny had left something behind. A journal, a clue, anything that could explain what had happened. Splitting up felt wrong, but the house was too big to search together. I ended up in Danny's room, the door creaking loudly as I pushed it open. The room was exactly how I remembered it from when we were kids, though the years had dulled its edges. The posters on the walls were faded, the colors washed out. The bed was unmade, the sheets crumpled and stained with dust. A stack of old notebooks sat on the desk, their pages yellowed with age. I picked one up, my hands trembling slightly, and flipped it open. At first, it seemed ordinary. Pages filled with messy handwriting, sketches of trees, notes about school. But as I flipped further, the tone shifted. The writing became erratic, the lines slanting sharply across the page. The sketches grew darker, trees with twisted limbs, their roots tangled around shadowy figures. Symbols began to appear, drawn in heavy, jagged strokes that seemed to tear into the paper. They matched the carvings we'd seen in the church. And then, near the back of the notebook, I found the last entry. The handwriting was shaky, the words scrawled hastily across the page. "It's watching me. It knows I've seen it. The forest is alive. The church is the key, but it's not enough. They'll never let me leave. If you find this, stay away. Don't follow the whispers." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words, my breath catching in my throat. The forest, the church, the whispers. It was all connected, but I didn't understand how. Not yet. A noise broke the silence behind me, a faint, creaking sound, like footsteps on the old wooden floor. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. It landed on the door, now slightly ajar, though I was sure I had closed it behind me. "Ethan," I called out, my voice trembling. No response. Just the faint sound of the wind outside, rattling the loose panes of glass in the windows. I took a step toward the door, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The hallway beyond was empty, but the air felt wrong. Thicker, colder. The shadows seemed to shift as I stepped into the hall, pooling in the corners like liquid. I gripped the notebook tightly, its edges digging into my palm as I moved toward the stairs. When I reached the bottom, the others were already gathered in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. Brooke was holding another notebook, her fingers shaking as she flipped through the pages. "He knew," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Danny knew about it. He was trying to stop it. The words settled over us like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. If Danny had been trying to stop whatever was happening, he'd failed. And now, we were caught in the same web. The candle on the table flickered suddenly, its flame shrinking to a faint, trembling ember. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, pressing in around us. The whispers returned, faint and distant, threading through the air like a dark melody. They weren't words, not yet, but they carried a weight that made my chest tighten. And then, from somewhere outside, a sound cut through the silence. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, like the rumble of a distant storm. How high? It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. We turned toward the window, but the glass was too dirty, the darkness outside too complete to see anything. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the walls. My stomach churned as I realized it wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around us, echoing through the town like a warning. Ethan grabbed the flashlight, his knuckles white as he gripped it tightly. "We need to move," he said, his voice low and steady, but I could hear the fear beneath it. None of us argued. We knew, without saying it, that staying in the house wasn't an option. Whatever was out there wasn't going to wait. The growling didn't stop as we stepped into the night. It followed us, a low, resonant hum, that seemed to come from the very air around us. The town was darker than it should have been, the streetlights barely casting enough light to show the uneven pavement beneath our feet. The shadows between the buildings seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally as we moved. I kept my flashlight trained on the ground, too afraid to look into the void surrounding us. We moved quickly, staying close together, the silence between us heavy with unspoken fear. The air felt colder with each step, each breath forming a faint cloud in front of me. It wasn't just the cold, though. It was the weight of the place, the way it pressed down on me, making every movement feel like I was wading through something thick and unseen. The notebook in my bag seemed heavier too, its presence an anchor pulling at my thoughts. The woods were waiting for us at the edge of town, a wall of blackness that seemed to swallow the faint light from the street. The growling was louder now, pulsing in time with my heartbeat. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, the metal cold and slick in my hand. My fingers were trembling, and I told myself it was just the cold, but I knew better. Ethan stopped at the tree line, his silhouette outlined by the faint glow of the town behind us. He turned to look at us, his expression grim. "We stick together," he said, his voice low and firm. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a plea. None of us argued. The forest was worse than I remembered. The trees were taller, their twisted limbs reaching out like claws, blocking out what little light we had. The ground was uneven, covered in a thick layer of leaves that muffled our footsteps, but made every sound around us seem louder. The growling had faded into the background, replaced by a deeper silence that seemed to absorb everything, even the sound of my own breathing. The farther we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their bark covered in a dark, sticky substance that glistened in the light of our flashlights. Strange markings appeared on the trunks, the same spiraling symbols we'd seen in the church. They seemed to pulse faintly, as if alive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. The path narrowed, forcing us into a single file, and the air grew colder still. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't fully explain. I kept my eyes on the ground, focusing on the faint beam of light in front of me, but the whispers began to creep back into the edges of my mind. They were faint at first, a low murmur that could have been the wind, but they grew louder with each step, threading through my thoughts like a dark melody. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had opened its jaws to spit us out. The ground here was bare, the dirt dry and cracked, as though nothing had dared to grow here for years. In the center stood a structure, an old crumbling cabin, its walls leaning at odd angles as if it had been abandoned long before any of us were born. The roof was partially caved in, and the windows were dark, their glass long since shattered. Ethan stepped forward, his flashlight cutting through the shadows, and I followed, my legs heavy with dread. The growling returned, louder now, coming from the direction of the cabin. It wasn't steady. It rose and fell in strange, uneven bursts, like something breathing in the dark. I wanted to run, to turn back and leave this place behind, but my feet wouldn't move. The notebook in my bag felt like a weight dragging me forward. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, swinging gently in the faint breeze. The growling stopped the moment Ethan pushed it open, replaced by a silence so deep it made my ears ring. The air inside was colder than it had any right to be, and the smell of damp wood and decay was overwhelming. My flashlight beam wavered as I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking beneath my weight. The cabin was empty, at least at first glance. The walls were bare, the floor covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris. But the symbols were everywhere, carved deep into the wood, spiraling across the walls and ceiling in chaotic patterns. They pulsed faintly, the same dark red glow we'd seen in the church, and I could feel them pressing against my mind, pulling at my thoughts. Brooke moved toward the far corner of the room, her flashlight illuminating a pile of old papers and broken furniture. She froze suddenly, her breath hitching in her throat. "Guys," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "There's something here." We gathered around her, the faint light of our flashlights pooling on the ground. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. A circle, drawn in the dirt, surrounded by strange objects. Bones, small and delicate, arranged in intricate patterns. Feathers, charred and brittle, scattered around the edges. And at the center, a crude wooden figure, its surface blackened and cracked, with symbols carved deep into its surface. The whispers grew louder, filling the cabin with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The wooden figure pulsed faintly, the symbols on its surface glowing in time with the beating of my heart. I reached for it without thinking, my hand trembling as my fingers brushed against the rough surface. The moment I touched it, the air in the cabin changed. The whispers stopped, replaced by a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through my bones. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their light blinding and searing, and the wooden figure in my hand grew warm, almost hot, as though it were alive. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, the growling returned, louder, closer, and more terrible than before. The growling was no longer distant. It was here, circling the cabin like a predator closing in on its prey. The sound vibrated through the walls, shaking loose bits of wood and dirt that fell to the ground in dry, brittle clumps. My heart raced, each beat slamming against my chest as I tightened my grip on the flashlight. The crude wooden figure in my other hand burned against my skin, its surface almost too hot to hold, but I couldn't bring myself to let go. The air inside the cabin was electric, charged with a presence that pressed down on me, heavy and suffocating. The symbols on the walls were alive now, their faint glow building into a searing brightness that cast twisted shadows across the room. Those shadows didn't match our movements. They writhed and stretched independently, creeping along the walls like living things. I couldn't look at them for too long without feeling a deep, nauseating pull in my chest. Brooke backed into a corner, her flashlight shaking as she aimed it toward the doorway. "It's outside," she whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't need to say it for me to know. Oh, I could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing against the thin walls of the cabin, testing the boundaries of the space. The growling deepened, a guttural, primal sound that seemed to resonate in my bones. A sudden, sharp knock rattled the door, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. It wasn't a human knock. It was too forceful, too rhythmic, like something mimicking a sound it didn't quite understand. The door creaked under the pressure, its hinges groaning as though they might give way at any moment. I took a step back, my legs trembling, and tightened my grip on the figure in my hand. Ethan moved toward the door, his face pale but set with determination. "Don't!" I hissed, my voice barely audible. But he didn't stop. His flashlight beam wavered as he reached for the doorknob, his hand shaking. The knock came again, harder this time, and I thought the entire door might splinter. Ethan hesitated, his breath shallow and quick, before finally pulling his hand back. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind of silence that made you feel like you'd gone deaf. My ears rang in the absence of sound, and I held my breath, afraid to make even the slightest noise. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, their glow dimming, and for a moment I thought whatever was outside had gone. And then the window shattered. The sound was deafening, glass exploding inward in a shower of jagged shards that glinted in the pulsing light. Something dark and massive lunged through the opening, its form twisting and writhing as it hit the ground. It wasn't fully visible. Its edges seemed to blur and shift, like a shadow caught between this world and another. Its limbs were too long, its movements too fluid, and the air around it grew colder, carrying the stench of damp earth and decay. The growling was deafening now, coming from deep within its chest as it rose to its full height. It towered over us, its head nearly brushing the sagging ceiling, and its face, if it even had one, was a void. An empty, gaping nothingness that seemed to pull at the air around it. The flashlight beams wavered, their light dimming as though the thing was swallowing it whole. "Get back!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking as he grabbed a broken piece of wood from the floor and held it in front of him like a weapon. The creature didn't react. It didn't need to. The growling stopped suddenly, replaced by a low, resonant hum that filled the cabin, vibrating through my chest and making my vision blur. The wooden figure in my hand pulsed, its heat growing unbearable, and I dropped it with a sharp gasp. It hit the ground with a hollow thud, rolling to a stop near the center of the room. The creature's head snapped toward it, its movements jerky and unnatural, and the hum grew louder, almost like a chant. The symbols on the walls flared to life, their glow brighter than ever, and the cabin itself seemed to tremble, the floor beneath us groaning as though it might collapse. Brooke screamed as one of the shadows on the wall broke free, stretching toward her with claw-like fingers. She stumbled back, her flashlight falling from her hand and spinning wildly across the floor. I lunged for her, grabbing her arm and pulling her away as the shadow slammed into the ground where she'd been standing. The air around it shimmered, and I felt a cold so deep it burned, spreading through my arm and into my chest. "We have to get out of here," Olivia shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening hum. She was right. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a trap, a living thing that seemed intent on swallowing us whole. But the creature blocked the door, its massive form stretching and twisting as though it was becoming part of the space itself. The wall seemed to close in around it, the symbols bleeding together into a chaotic, writhing mass of light and shadow. The wooden figure pulsed again, its glow growing brighter, and I realized it wasn't just reacting to the creature, it was connected to it. The thought hit me like a jolt of electricity, and I stumbled back, my mind racing. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't just here to hunt us. It was tied to the figure, to the symbols, to the very ground beneath us. And the figure was the key. Ethan must have realized it too, because he dove for the figure, his hand closing around it just as the creature lunged. Its arm, or what passed for an arm, swept through the air, slamming into the ground where Ethan had been a moment before. The impact shook the cabin, the walls groaning as cracks spread across the floorboards. "Do something," Brooke shouted, her voice raw with panic. Ethan looked at me, the figure clutched tightly in his hand, and I saw the fear in his eyes. Fear, and something else. Resolve? Before I could stop him, he slammed the figure into the ground, breaking it in two. The light from the symbols flared brighter than ever, blinding and searing, and the creature let out a sound that wasn't a growl or a roar, but something far worse. It was a scream, raw and guttural, filled with a rage that shook the very air around us. And then the cabin collapsed. The collapse wasn't immediate. It started with the groaning of the walls, a low, resonant sound that vibrated through my chest. Dust rained down from the ceiling, caught in the pulsing light of the symbols as they burned brighter, consuming the shadows. The creature reeled, its form twisting and contorting, pulling at the air around it like it was trying to take the room itself apart. I barely had time to grab Brooke's arm before the floor gave way beneath us. The wood splintered with a deafening crack, and we were falling, swallowed by a darkness so thick it felt alive. My stomach lurched as gravity yanked me down, the cold air rushing past my face before I hit the ground with a bone-jarring thud. The impact sent a sharp pain shooting through my side, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp, spinning wildly before coming to a stop. The light from the flashlight flickered weakly, casting a narrow beam across the space. I pushed myself up on trembling hands, every breath a struggle as dust filled my lungs. My surroundings came into focus slowly, the shadows retreating just enough to reveal jagged stone walls covered in the same spiraling symbols. The air down here was colder, damp, and heavy, carrying the metallic tang of earth and decay. "Is everyone okay?" My voice cracked, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. Brooke groaned somewhere to my left, her silhouette shifting in the dim light. "I think so," she muttered, her voice thick with pain. Olivia was already on her feet, her flashlight illuminating Ethan as he struggled to stand. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the broken pieces of the wooden figure to his chest. The ground beneath us felt wrong, not solid, but soft and spongy, like it was barely holding itself together. My fingers brushed against it, and I recoiled instinctively. It wasn't dirt. It was cold and slick, almost like flesh, and it pulsed faintly beneath my touch. My stomach turned, bile rising in my throat as I scrambled to my feet. The creature's scream echoed through the chamber, distant but still piercing, a reminder that it wasn't gone. Not entirely. The sound reverberated through the walls, shaking loose small rocks and bits of debris that clattered to the ground. The pulsing symbols on the wall seemed to flicker in response, their rhythm uneven, like a heartbeat on the verge of stopping. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice tight. He was right. Staying here wasn't an option, not with the ground shifting beneath us and the walls closing in. The only visible path was a narrow tunnel that sloped downward, its entrance framed by jagged stones that jutted out like teeth. The light from my flashlight barely penetrated the darkness beyond it, but there was nowhere else to go. The tunnel was worse than the cabin. The walls were slick, glistening with the same dark, sticky substance we'd seen on the trees in the forest. The ceiling was low, forcing us to crouch as we moved, and the air was so thick it felt like I was breathing through a wet cloth. Every step forward was a fight against the growing sense of dread that clawed at my chest. The whispers started again as we moved deeper, faint at first, like a distant murmur, just beyond the edges of hearing. But they grew louder, more distinct, threading through the air like an invasive thought I couldn't shake. They weren't words, not exactly, but they carried meaning. A sense of longing and hunger that made my skin crawl. The tunnel opened into another chamber, larger than the one we'd fallen into. The ground here was covered in more of the strange pulsing material, and the air hummed with a low, steady vibration that made my teeth ache. At the center of the room stood a stone altar, its surface etched with symbols, so intricate they seemed to ripple and shift when I looked at them. The broken wooden figure in Ethan's hands began to glow faintly, its fractured edges pulsing in time with the light from the altar. "We're not alone," Olivia said, her voice barely more than a whisper. She was right. Shadows flickered at the edges of the chamber, moving in ways that didn't match the light from our flashlights. They shifted and stretched, taking on shapes that were almost human, but not quite, their movements too fluid, too unnatural. My grip on the flashlight tightened as the air grew colder, the whispers rising to a crescendo that filled the room with sound. The creature emerged from the darkness like a nightmare made flesh, its form barely visible, but no less terrifying. It was taller now, its limbs impossibly long, its movements jerky and chaotic. The void where its face should have been seemed to pull at the air around it, distorting the space as it moved toward us. Ethan stepped forward, the glowing figure held out in front of him like a shield. The creature paused, its head tilting as if studying him, and the whispers faltered for a moment before surging back, louder and more insistent. The air around us shimmered, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to pulse in time with the creature's movements. "What do we do?" Brooke's voice was high and panicked, her flashlight beam bouncing wildly as she backed away. I didn't have an answer. The altar seemed important. Its presence felt deliberate, like it was meant to be here. But I didn't know what we were supposed to do with it. The whispers grew louder still, pressing against my mind, unraveling my thoughts until it felt like there was no room left for anything else. Ethan moved toward the altar, his steps slow and deliberate. The creature followed, its movements mirroring his as though drawn to the light from the figure in his hands. The glow from the altar grew brighter as he approached, the symbols on its surface flaring to life in a cascade of light and shadow. "Whatever you're doing," I said, my voice trembling, "do it fast." Ethan didn't respond. He placed the broken figure on the altar, his hands shaking, and the light flared so brightly I had to shield my eyes. The chamber trembled, the air filled with a sound that was somewhere between a scream and a roar, and the creature lunged. Everything went white. The light wasn't just bright, it was blinding, an all-consuming brilliance that swallowed everything. My eyes burned as I tried to focus, but there was nothing to see, just a vast, empty white stretching in every direction. The air around me vibrated, humming with a low frequency that resonated deep in my chest, shaking my ribs. I felt weightless, and yet crushed at the same time, like the very fabric of the space was pressing against my skin. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the light vanished. I stumbled forward, my legs weak, my breath ragged, as darkness rushed back in to fill the void. The chamber was still there, but it wasn't the same. The walls no longer pulsed with light. Instead, they were cold, jagged, and silent. The air felt thicker, heavier, and each breath came with the faint taste of metal, like blood on the back of my tongue. The altar was shattered, its pieces scattered across the ground. The glowing wooden figure was gone. Nothing remained of it but faint scorch marks that radiated outward from where it had been. Ethan was on his knees in front of the altar, his head hanging low, his shoulders trembling. I couldn't tell if he was hurt or just overwhelmed, but the sight of him like that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Ethan," I called, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer. I stepped closer, careful not to trip on the uneven ground. My flashlight flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the space, and I stopped short when I saw his face. He was crying, silent tears carving paths down his dirt-streaked cheeks. His eyes were open, but they weren't focused on anything. It was as if he was looking through the world, into something far beyond it. His lips moved, but no sound came out, just the faint twitch of words I couldn't hear. I reached out, my hand trembling, but the moment I touched his shoulder, he flinched violently, scrambling back as if I'd struck him. "They're still here," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It didn't work. It just made them angrier." A chill ran down my spine, and I turned to look around the chamber. The shadows were moving again, creeping along the walls, but they weren't chaotic this time. They were deliberate, purposeful, sliding together into shapes that made my stomach twist. Faces formed in the dark, their hollow eyes staring, their mouths open in silent screams. The whispers returned, faint at first, but building, threading through the air like a song, sung in a language I couldn't understand. Brooke and Olivia were huddled together near the edge of the room, their flashlights shaking as they darted from shadow to shadow. Brooke's face was pale, her breathing rapid, and Olivia was muttering under her breath, a constant stream of words I couldn't quite make out. They both looked at me when the whispers grew louder, their eyes wide with fear. "What do we do now?" Brooke asked, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. The creature was gone, or at least, it wasn't here. But its presence lingered, a weight in the air that pressed down on all of us. The symbols on the walls were dim now, their glow reduced to faint, flickering embers, but they still pulsed faintly, in time with the whispers. And then I saw it, a faint light, deep within the shadows at the far end of the chamber. It wasn't like the pulsing glow of the symbols, or the searing brightness of the altar. It was softer, warmer, flickering like the flame of a candle caught in the wind. It shouldn't have been comforting, but in that moment, it was. It was the only thing in this place that didn't feel hostile. "We go there," I said, pointing toward the light. My voice was steadier than I felt, and the others hesitated before nodding. Ethan struggled to his feet, his movements slow and jerky, and together we moved toward the flickering glow. The closer we got, the colder the air became, and the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. My flashlight flickered and died, plunging us into near total darkness, save for that single point of light. My hands shook as I fumbled with it, but it wouldn't turn back on. The batteries drained as if the thing itself had given up. When we reached the light, I realized it wasn't a flame at all. It was a small circular pool of water, perfectly still and glowing faintly from within. The surface reflected nothing, not even the faint glimmers of light from the dying symbols on the walls. It was like a hole in the fabric of reality, a window into something far beyond what I could understand. "What is this?" Olivia whispered, her voice barely audible over the whispers that filled the chamber. "It's the source," Ethan said, his voice hollow. "The connection. It's where they came through." I didn't want to ask how he knew. His eyes were fixed on the pool, and I could see the same distant, unfocused look he'd had in front of the altar. Whatever he'd seen, whatever had happened when he broke the figure, it had changed him. The shadows pressed closer as we stood there, the faces in the dark more distinct now, their hollow eyes watching us intently. The whispers grew sharper, their words almost clear, and I felt them clawing at the edges of my mind, pulling at my thoughts, twisting them into shapes that weren't mine. Ethan stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, and knelt at the edge of the pool. The light reflected faintly in his eyes, and he reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface. "We have to finish it," he said, his voice steady. "It's the only way." "Finish what?" Rook's voice was sharp, panicked. "What are you talking about?" Ethan didn't answer. He plunged his hand into the pool, and the world around us erupted into chaos. The light flared, blinding and cold, and the ground beneath us trembled violently. The shadows screamed, their voices merging into a single deafening wail that filled the air. The walls began to crack and splinter, chunks of stone falling away to reveal more darkness beyond. The whispers rose into a crescendo, a cacophony of sound that made my head feel like it was going to split open. Ethan's body tensed, his back arching as the light from the pool consumed him, spreading outward in tendrils of glowing mist. The symbols on the walls flared to life one last time, their light burning so brightly it seared my vision, and then everything went silent. When the light faded, the chamber was empty. The shadows were gone. The whispers had stopped. The pool was dark, its surface cold and lifeless, and Ethan was nowhere to be seen. The air was still and heavy, and the only sound was the faint echo of our ragged breathing. I sank to my knees, my chest heaving as I tried to process what had just happened. Brooke and Olivia were silent, their faces pale, their eyes wide and unfocused. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. Whatever had happened here, whatever Ethan had done, it was over. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But deep in the silence, I thought I heard something, a faint, distant whisper, threading through the air like a warning, or a promise. The air around Willow Ridge had a strange weight to it, the kind that made every breath feel like it carried something unseen, something alive. The town had always been small, quiet, and just a little too remote, but this was different. It wasn't just the isolation. It was the way the trees seemed to lean closer as we drove into town, their branches twisting together like skeletal hands blocking out the gray sky. It was the way the streets felt deserted, even though I could see movement behind the curtains of the old, weathered houses. The letter from Danny had come 2 weeks earlier. At first, I thought it was a cruel prank. After all, Danny had been gone for over a decade. His disappearance was the kind of tragedy that left scars, the kind of loss that had sent the rest of us scattering across the country, trying to bury the memories of what had happened. But the handwriting was his, down to the crooked S, and the way he always pressed too hard with his pen. The words were simple, but chilling. "Come to Willow Ridge. There's something you need to see." So we came. I don't know if it was guilt, curiosity, or something deeper that drove us back. But now, standing at the edge of the woods, staring at the map Danny had included in a letter, I wasn't sure we'd made the right choice. The map was crude, hand-drawn, leading us to a place we had promised each other we would never return to. The woods, the caves, the place where Danny had last been seen. The trees swallowed the light as soon as we stepped off the road. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that clung to your skin and settled deep in your bones. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the narrow trail, the beam cutting through the dense underbrush. The others were close behind me, their footsteps crunching on the uneven ground, but the forest seemed to devour the sound, leaving only the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. The map led us deeper than I remembered, the trail winding like a serpent through the trees. The underbrush grew thicker, the branches above us forming a canopy so tight it blocked out what little light was left from the overcast sky. I checked my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, there wasn't. I shoved it back into my pocket, my pulse quickening as the trail narrowed even further. Then we saw it, the entrance to the cave. It was smaller than I remembered, almost hidden by the tangle of roots and vines that draped over its jagged edges. The opening gaped like a mouth, its darkness impenetrable, even under the beam of my flashlight. The air here was different, heavier, with a faint metallic tang that made my stomach churn. My chest tightened as I stepped closer, the cold radiating from the entrance like an open freezer door. The others hesitated, but I couldn't stop myself. There was something here, something pulling me forward, a presence I couldn't explain. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the air changed. It wasn't just cold anymore, it was alive, pressing against my skin like invisible hands. The walls of the cave were damp and slick, the stone glistening faintly in the dim light. The ceiling was low, forcing us to crouch as we moved deeper, the sound of our breathing loud and ragged in the confined space. The map led us through a series of narrow tunnels, each one tighter and darker than the last. The smell grew stronger as we went, a mix of earth, rot, and something else, something sharp and metallic that stung the back of my throat. My flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the darkness around me felt absolute, pressing in on all sides. We reached the chamber suddenly, the narrow tunnel opening up into a wide, circular space. The ceiling rose high above us, disappearing into the shadows, and the walls were covered in markings. At first, I thought they were just scratches, the kind of random gouges you might find in an old cave. But as my eyes adjusted, I realized they were deliberate, symbols carved deep into the stone, their patterns spiraling and twisting in ways that made my head ache. The center of the chamber was dominated by a large stone slab, its surface worn smooth and stained with dark rust-colored streaks. I didn't want to think about what could have caused those stains, but my mind filled the blanks for me anyway. The air here was different, heavier, as if the chamber itself was breathing, its walls expanding and contracting in slow, deliberate waves. And then I heard it, a whisper, faint and indistinct, like the rustle of leaves on the wind. It wasn't coming from the others. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide as they scanned the room. The sound was coming from the stone slab. My flashlight shook in my hand as I moved closer, the beam trembling over the symbols carved into its surface. The whisper grew louder as I approached, resolving into words I couldn't understand. They weren't in any language I'd ever heard, but they carried weight, pressing against my thoughts like an unwelcome presence. My vision blurred, the edges of the room darkening as the words burrowed into my mind, twisting and pulling until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whisper stopped. The silence was deafening, the kind that made my ears ring. I stumbled back, gasping for air, and nearly dropped my flashlight. The others were staring at me, their faces etched with fear, but before I could say anything, the ground beneath us shook. It wasn't a subtle tremor. It was violent, the kind of movement that sent cracks racing up the walls and loose stones crashing to the floor. The symbols on the walls flared to life, glowing with a faint, sickly light that pulsed in time with the tremors. The air grew colder still, the metallic tang sharpening until it felt like I was choking on it. And then the light from the symbols began to move. It spilled off the walls like liquid, pooling on the floor before rising into the air in tendrils of faintly glowing mist. The tendrils twisted and writhed, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite, their edges too sharp, their movements too fluid. The whispering returned, louder now, filling the chamber with a sound that was both beautiful and terrible. The tendrils moved closer, their glowing edges flickering like flames, and I felt a pull deep in my chest, a compulsion I couldn't fight. My feet moved on their own, dragging me toward the stone slab, the whispers growing louder with each step. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the surface of the slab. The cold was immediate, burning against my skin, and the whispers stopped. For a brief moment, the chamber was silent, the tendrils frozen in place, the symbols dimming to a faint glow. And then the world exploded into light. The light didn't just illuminate the chamber, it consumed it, erasing every shadow and searing itself into my vision. I threw up an arm to shield my eyes, but it didn't help. The light wasn't coming from a single source. It was everywhere, pouring out of the walls, the floor, the symbols themselves. It pulsed in time with the trembling ground beneath us, each wave of brightness carrying a heavy, resonant hum that pressed against my chest like a physical weight. When it finally dimmed, the world came back into focus slowly, hazy, and disoriented. My legs wobbled as I lowered my arm, blinking against the afterimages burned into my eyes. The chamber had changed. The carvings on the walls were glowing faintly now, their spiraling shapes twisting in ways that made my stomach churn if I looked too long. The air was colder, damp and metallic, and the whispers were back. Soft at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each passing second. The others were scattered around me, their faces pale, their breaths shallow and uneven. Mark clutched his flashlight tightly, his knuckles white, while Rachel stood frozen near the entrance, her eyes fixed on the glowing walls. Julie was closest to me, her hands trembling as she pointed toward the center of the room. The stone slab. It wasn't just a slab anymore. The surface, once smooth and cold, was rippling, as though something beneath it was struggling to break free. The dark stains had spread, their edges glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the symbols. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, a low, guttural chant that reverberated in my skull, making it impossible to think. And then the rippling stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The whispers fell silent, the trembling ground steadied, and even the air felt lighter, as though whatever force had been building was finally at rest. I let out a shaky breath, glancing at the others to see if they felt it too. But before I could say anything, the slab cracked. The sound was sharp, splitting through the silence like a gunshot. A jagged line spread across the surface, glowing with a blinding white light that seeped into the room. Another crack followed, then another, until the entire slab was webbed with fractures. The light grew brighter, spilling out in beams that danced across the chamber, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, their overlapping voices forming a single wordless command. Move. I stumbled backward, dragging Julie with me as the slab gave way, collapsing inward with a deafening crash. The ground beneath it buckled, sending chunks of stone tumbling into the void below. A wave of heat rushed out, carrying with it the stench of decay and something else, something ancient and sour, like iron left to rust in stagnant water. The void was deep, impossibly so. My flashlight beam barely scratched the surface of the darkness, but I could see movement within it, shapes writhing and shifting, their outlines indistinct but undeniably alive. The whispers were deafening now, their voices clawing at my thoughts, pulling me closer to the edge of the pit. Something was coming. The first tendril emerged slowly, unfurling from the darkness like a vine reaching for sunlight. It was blacker than anything I'd ever seen, its surface glistening as it pulsed with faint, red veins. It moved with a deliberate, predatory grace, curling upward and anchoring itself to the edge of the broken slab. Another tendril followed, then another, until the void was alive with them, writhing and twisting as they pulled something massive toward the surface. Julie's grip tightened on my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she whispered, "We need to go." She didn't have to say it twice. I turned and ran, pulling her along with me as the ground trembled beneath our feet. Mark and Rachel were ahead of us, their flashlights bouncing wildly as they scrambled toward the tunnel. The whispers followed, louder and more insistent, filling the air with a maddening cacophony that drowned out the sound of our own frantic breathing. We reached the tunnel just as the first tendril lashed out, striking the ground where we'd been moments before. The impact shook the chamber, sending cracks racing up the walls, and I felt a surge of cold air rush past me as more tendrils emerged from the void. I didn't look back. Hadn't. The tunnel was narrow, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through, and the walls felt closer than they had before, their jagged surfaces scraping against my shoulders as I ran. The whispers didn't fade as we moved deeper into the tunnel. If anything, they grew louder, their voices overlapping and distorting until they formed something almost like words. I couldn't understand them, but I could feel their intent, their hunger, pressing against my thoughts like a storm. It wasn't just noise. It was alive. We stumbled into a smaller chamber, barely more than a hollow in the rock, and collapsed against the walls, gasping for breath. The air here was no better, thick and stagnant, but at least the whispers were quieter. Rachel was the first to speak, her voice shaking as she stared at the tunnel behind us. What the hell was that? None of us answered. There wasn't an answer, not one that made sense anyway. My mind was still racing, replaying the image of the tendrils, the void, the way the light had seemed to crawl along the walls like it was alive. It wasn't natural. It wasn't human. And it wasn't over. The ground beneath us shifted again, a low rumble that felt more like a warning than a tremor. Mark's flashlight flickered as he swept the beam across the chamber, illuminating more of the strange symbols carved into the walls. They weren't glowing anymore, but their presence was unsettling, like a reminder that we weren't supposed to be here. Julie pulled the map from her pocket, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The lines leading to the chamber were clear, but there was something else now, another path, one that hadn't been there before. It wasn't drawn in ink. It was etched into the paper itself, the lines faint but undeniable. "It's leading us somewhere," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't keep going. We don't even know what's down here." "We know what's behind us," Mark snapped, his voice tight. "Do you want to go back to that?" I didn't want to go back, but I wasn't sure I wanted to go forward either. The map, the symbols, the whispers, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. But the choice wasn't ours anymore. Whatever we'd awakened in that chamber wasn't going to let us leave. Not without finishing what it had started. The tunnel stretched ahead of us like an open vein, pulsing faintly with a sickly light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere all at once. The air was colder now, heavy with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat and left my lungs burning with every breath. My flashlight flickered weakly, its beam barely penetrating the suffocating darkness. The whispers followed us, growing louder with every step, their indistinct words threading through the cracks in my thoughts like parasites burrowing deeper. Rachel clung to the wall ahead of me, her movements jerky and frantic as she tried to keep her balance on the uneven ground. Her breathing was shallow, sharp, and quick, echoing off the damp stone around us. Mark was just behind her, muttering something under his breath that I couldn't quite make out. Julie stayed close to me, her flashlight steady, but her hands trembling, the beam casting distorted shadows that writhed along the walls like living things. I didn't know how long we'd been walking. Time had lost all meaning down here. Every step felt the same, every turn identical, as though the cave was deliberately trying to disorient us, to keep us moving in circles. The symbols on the walls had returned, faint and flickering, their patterns more chaotic now, their spirals tighter and sharper, as if reflecting the growing tension in the air. Rachel stopped suddenly, her flashlight jerking upward as she stared at something ahead of us. I nearly ran into her, my pulse quickening as I followed her gaze. The tunnel opened into a wide chamber, the walls arching upward into a dome that seemed to stretch impossibly high. The air here was colder still, carrying a faint vibration that hummed against my skin and made my teeth ache. At the center of the chamber stood another stone structure, smaller than the slab we'd seen before, but no less ominous. It was a pedestal, its surface etched with the same spiraling symbols, but what drew my attention wasn't the carvings, it was what rested on top. A black polished bowl sat there, its surface so smooth it seemed to drink in the light. The liquid inside it rippled faintly, though there was no wind, no movement, to disturb it. The whispers surged as we stepped into the chamber, their voices rising to a crescendo that filled the space, pressing against my skull, until I thought it might crack. They weren't words anymore. They were feelings, sharp and invasive, pulling at my thoughts and twisting them into something dark and unfamiliar. Fear, hunger, desperation. Mark took a step toward the pedestal, his flashlight trembling in his hand. "Don't," I said, my voice barely audible over the whispers. He didn't stop. His movements were slow, almost mechanical, as though something was pulling him forward. Rachel grabbed his arm, trying to stop him, but he shook her off, his eyes fixed on the bowl. He reached out, his hand hovering just above the surface of the liquid, and for a moment everything was still. The whispers fell silent, the air thick with anticipation, and then his fingers dipped into the liquid. The reaction was immediate. The liquid rippled violently, the surface breaking apart as a sharp metallic screech filled the chamber. Mark stumbled back, clutching his hand, but the damage was already done. The pedestal began to tremble, cracks spreading across its surface, and the symbols on the walls flared to life, their light searing and blinding. The ground beneath us shook, and the whispers returned, louder than ever, their voices overlapping into a deafening roar. The walls seemed to close in around us, the air vibrating with an energy that made my skin crawl. The bowl tipped over, the liquid spilling onto the ground and spreading outward in jagged, branching streams that glowed faintly in the darkness. Julie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "We need to move," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. I didn't argue. I turned and ran, pulling her with me as the chamber collapsed around us. The others followed, their footsteps pounding against the stone as we stumbled back toward the tunnel. The ground heaved beneath us, cracks spiderwebbing across the floor as chunks of stone fell from the ceiling. The whispers were everywhere now, inside my head, tearing through my thoughts like claws. The tunnel seemed to stretch and warp as we ran, the walls shifting and twisting as though alive. The light from the symbols flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the stone, and I could feel something chasing us. Something massive and relentless. We burst into another chamber, smaller than the last, but no less oppressive. The air here was even colder, the metallic tang sharper, almost choking. The symbols on the walls were brighter now, their spirals more erratic, and the whispers grew louder still, their voices rising to an unbearable pitch. Mark collapsed against the wall, his chest heaving as he gasped for air. "What the hell was that?" Rachel demanded, her voice shaking. None of us had an answer. The only thing I knew for certain was that whatever we'd awakened, it wasn't going to stop. It wasn't going to let us leave. Julie pulled out the map, her hands trembling as she unfolded it. The lines leading to the chamber we'd just left were clear, but there was something else now, another path, faint and jagged, etched into the paper as though it had been burned there. It led deeper, the lines spiraling inward toward a single point marked with a symbol I didn't recognize. "It's guiding us," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It wants us to go there." Rachel shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "We can't keep going. We don't even know what's down here." I didn't want to keep going, but the truth was, we didn't have a choice. The whispers were still there, pressing against my thoughts, pulling me forward. The cave wasn't just a place, it was alive, and it wasn't going to let us go until it got what it wanted. The tunnel ahead was darker than the ones we'd come through before. The air colder, the whispers louder. My flashlight flickered weakly as we stepped forward, the beam cutting through the suffocating darkness. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong, soft and spongy, like it was barely holding itself together. The deeper we went, the stronger the pull became, an invisible force dragging us towards something vast and unknowable. The whispers were no longer just sounds. They were thoughts, threading through my mind, twisting and distorting, until I couldn't tell where they ended and I began. My chest tightened, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps, but I couldn't stop. None of us could. The path ahead sloped downward, the walls narrowing until we were forced to crouch as we moved. The air was thick now, almost suffocating, and the light from the symbols was blinding, their spirals spinning faster and faster, until they seemed to blur together. My head throbbed, my thoughts unraveling with each step, and I knew, deep down, that whatever was waiting for us at the end of this tunnel wasn't going to let us leave. The tunnel ahead felt more like a throat than a passage, narrowing and twisting in ways that made every step feel like a transgression. The air was colder now, thick with moisture and carrying a faint metallic tang that coated the back of my throat. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, its beam swallowed by shadows that seemed to move on their own, writhing just out of sight. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder here, more distinct, their tones layered and urgent, threading through my mind like barbed wire. Julie stayed close behind me, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she swept it along the walls. The spiraling symbols carved into the stone were brighter now, their glow casting faint, pulsing light that made the shadows seem alive. Rachel and Mark followed, their breathing loud and uneven in the suffocating silence between the whispers. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The cave had already taken over. It was guiding us now, dragging us deeper with every step. The ground beneath us grew softer, spongy and wet, and I realized with a sick jolt that it wasn't stone anymore. It felt organic, like flesh or decayed plant matter, squelching underfoot as we moved. The smell of rot grew stronger, mingling with the metallic tang in the air until it was almost unbearable. My stomach churned, and I fought the urge to gag, covering my mouth with one hand as I stumbled forward. The tunnel opened suddenly, spilling us into a vast chamber that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My flashlight flickered, its beam sweeping across a space that defied logic. The walls were impossibly high, curving upward into a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. The floor was uneven, covered in the same fleshy, pulsing material that squelched under my boots. In the center of the room stood another pedestal, larger than the last, its surface carved with intricate symbols that glowed faintly, pulsing in time with the whispers. But it wasn't the pedestal that held my attention. It was what loomed above it. The thing was massive, its form shifting and writhing as though it couldn't decide what shape to take. It was made of shadows and tendrils, its edges blurring and flickering like smoke caught in a strong wind. Its presence filled the room, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. There were no eyes, no face, but I could feel it watching us, its attention, a tangible weight that pinned me in place. The whispers surged, filling the chamber with a deafening roar that made my head throb. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, the soft, wet surface beneath me giving way slightly under my weight. The others were frozen, their faces pale and etched with terror as they stared at the shifting mass above the pedestal. The thing didn't move closer, but it didn't need to. Its presence was enough to make the air feel like it was crushing us. Julie was the first to break the silence, her voice a shaky whisper. "What is that?" Her question hung in the air, unanswered, as the thing above the pedestal began to shift. Its tendrils reached out, curling and twisting as they moved through the air, their edges glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the symbols on the walls. One of the tendrils brushed the ground, and the whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the room into a silence so profound it was almost worse. The thing moved suddenly, a blur of motion as it reared back, its tendrils snapping toward us like whips. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as one of the tendrils slammed into the ground where I'd been standing. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, the fleshy ground rippling like water. Julie screamed, her flashlight spinning wildly as she stumbled backward, narrowly avoiding another tendril. "We have to move," Rachel shouted, her voice breaking as she grabbed Mark and pulled him toward the far side of the room. The pedestal was glowing brighter now, its symbols pulsing in time with the thing's movements, as though it was feeding off its energy. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent, their tones rising into a frantic crescendo that filled my skull with static. I scrambled to my feet, my heart pounding as I followed the others, my flashlight beam cutting through the chaos. The chamber seemed to shift around us, the walls twisting and bending as though the cave itself was alive. Every step felt like a struggle, the fleshy ground pulling at my boots, the air thick and heavy, each breath a battle. Julie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, as she pulled me toward the edge of the room. "There's another passage," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the whispers. My flashlight flickered as I followed her gaze, illuminating a narrow opening in the wall, barely wide enough to squeeze through. It wasn't there before. Or maybe it had been, and we hadn't seen it. Either way, it was our only chance. We ran, the thing's tendrils lashing out behind us, carving deep gouges into the ground. The whispers grew louder still, their tones almost melodic now, rising and falling in a pattern that made my head spin. The symbols on the walls flared to life as we passed, their light burning brighter, casting long, jagged shadows that danced and writhed like living things. The passage was tighter than I had expected, the walls closing in around us as we squeezed through. The air here was colder, the metallic tang sharper, almost painful. My flashlight died as we moved deeper, plunging us into near-total darkness, save for the faint glow of the symbols that lined the walls. The whispers followed us, fainter now, but still present, threading through the silence like a distant song. The passage opened into another chamber, smaller but no less oppressive. The air here was heavier, the metallic tang replaced by the sharp, acrid scent of burning. The walls were smoother, their surfaces slick and reflective, and the ground beneath us was hard and uneven, the fleshy material giving way to jagged stone. In the center of the room stood another pedestal, identical to the one we'd just left, but this one was empty. No bowl, no glowing liquid, just the symbols, carved deep into the stone, their lines sharp and angular, radiating a faint pulsing light. Rachel stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for the pedestal. "Don't," I said, my voice weak, but she didn't stop. Her fingers brushed the surface, and the room exploded with light. The whispers surged, deafening and all-consuming, as the pedestal began to glow, its symbols burning brighter and brighter until they were blinding. The ground trembled beneath us, cracks spreading outward from the pedestal as the walls began to shift, the smooth stone rippling like water. And then, from somewhere deep within the cave, I heard it, the low, guttural growl of something massive, something waking up. The growl was unlike anything I had ever heard, low and guttural, carrying a resonance that rattled through the very stone beneath my feet. It wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, filling the air and pressing down on my chest until it felt like I couldn't breathe. My legs locked, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. The whispers rose in response, a deafening cacophony that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves, their tones overlapping and crashing together like a violent tide. Rachel's hand jerked away from the pedestal as the symbols on its surface flared to life, their light searing and pulsing like an exposed nerve. The room around us began to shift, the walls rippling like liquid, bending and folding in ways that defied logic. The ground beneath us trembled violently, and I stumbled back, catching myself against the slick, cold stone of the wall. The pedestal glowed brighter, its surface cracking as if something beneath it was trying to break free. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the chamber like the groan of something massive stirring in its sleep. I turned toward the source, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I swept the beam across the room. The light caught movement, shadows shifting in the far corner, their edges blurring and twisting as they coalesced into something more tangible. It was massive, larger than I could comprehend, its form shrouded in darkness that seemed to ripple and pulse like a living thing. Tendrils of shadow snaked outward from its center, curling and twisting as they reached for the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Its movements were slow, deliberate, like it was testing its own boundaries. There was no face, no eyes, but I could feel it watching us, its presence pressing against my mind like an invasive thought I couldn't shake. Mark screamed first, a sharp, panicked sound that cut through the whispers. He turned and ran, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted toward the nearest passageway. The creature didn't move at first, its tendrils still as it seemed to consider him. And then, with a speed that defied its size, one of the tendrils lashed out, striking the ground inches from his feet. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber, knocking him off balance and slamming him into the wall. "Run!" Julie's voice was sharp and desperate, cutting through the chaos like a knife. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the narrow passage we had entered through, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Rachel was ahead of us, her flashlight flickering as she stumbled into the tunnel, her breathing ragged and frantic. The walls of the tunnel seemed to close in around us as we ran, their smooth, reflective surfaces rippling like water. The whispers followed, louder and more insistent, threading through my thoughts like hooks, pulling at my memories, my fears, my will to keep moving. The ground beneath us shifted with every step, the fleshy, pulsing material from before returning, gripping at our feet and slowing us down. Behind us, the creature roared, its growl transforming into a piercing shriek that sent a wave of cold air rushing through the tunnel. The sound was unbearable, a sharp grating noise that filled my skull and made my vision blur. My knees buckled, and I fell, my flashlight clattering to the ground and spinning wildly, casting erratic shadows along the walls. Julie was there, her hands gripping my arms as she hauled me to my feet. "Don't stop!" she shouted, her voice cracking with panic. "It's coming!" I forced my legs to move, every step a struggle against the weight pressing down on me. The tunnel twisted and turned, the walls narrowing until they scraped against my shoulders, the cold, slick surface chilling me through my clothes. The whispers were deafening now, their tones merging into a single guttural chant that filled the air with a sense of dread, so overwhelming it made my stomach turn. We stumbled into another chamber, smaller than the last, but no less oppressive. The walls were smoother here, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like shine that reflected the faint, sickly glow of the symbols etched into the stone. The air was colder still, sharp and acrid, burning my lungs with every breath. The ground beneath us was hard and uneven, littered with jagged shards of stone that glinted in the dim light. In the center of the room stood another pedestal, identical to the one we'd just left, but this one was different. The symbols carved into its surface were more intricate, their spirals tighter and more chaotic, and the glow they emitted was brighter, more intense, casting long, jagged shadows that danced along the walls. Atop the pedestal rested a small black object, its surface smooth and featureless, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. Rachel approached it slowly, her movements hesitant, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Don't touch it," I said, my voice barely more than a whisper. But she didn't stop. Something was pulling her forward. A compulsion I could see in her wide, unblinking eyes. Her hand reached out, trembling as her fingers brushed against the object. The reaction was immediate. The object pulsed, a deep, resonant vibration that shook the room and sent cracks racing across the walls. The whispers surged, rising to a deafening roar, and the symbols on the pedestal flared to life, their light burning brighter and brighter until it was blinding. The ground beneath us trembled violently, and the creature's growl returned, echoing through the chamber with a force that made the air itself vibrate. The pedestal shattered, the pieces flying outward in a burst of light and sound. The object fell to the ground, its surface glowing faintly as it rolled to a stop at my feet. I didn't want to touch it, but something in my chest tightened, an invisible hand wrapping around my ribs and pulling me forward. My fingers closed around the object, and the world went still. The whispers stopped. The light dimmed. The ground steadied beneath me. For a brief, fleeting moment, there was silence, a heavy, oppressive stillness that filled the air like a held breath. And then the growl came again, louder and closer, shaking the chamber and sending shards of stone raining from the ceiling. The creature was coming, and this time, it wasn't going to stop. The silence after the growl was worse than the sound itself. It was a charged, suffocating emptiness that filled every corner of the chamber, pressing against my ears and wrapping around my chest. I stood frozen, the small black object clutched tightly in my hand, its surface unnaturally warm, like it was alive. The whispers had stopped completely, leaving only the sound of my ragged breathing and the faint crackling of the broken pedestal behind me. Julie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, as she pulled me toward the far side of the room. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice trembling but insistent. Rachel and Mark followed, their faces pale, their flashlights casting erratic beams of light that seemed to make the shadows stretch and twist unnaturally. The walls around us felt closer, the symbols carved into them pulsing faintly, as if in warning. The tunnel ahead was narrow, its entrance barely wide enough to squeeze through. The air inside was colder, sharper, carrying the same metallic tang that had lingered in the larger chambers. I could feel it pressing against my skin, an almost electric sensation that made every hair on my body stand on end. The object in my hand pulsed faintly, its warmth intensifying as if responding to the growing tension in the air. The ground beneath us shifted with each step, soft and uneven, as though the stone itself was struggling to hold its form. The walls pulsed faintly, their glow steady but unsettling, like a heartbeat just beneath the surface. The further we went, the more the whispers began to creep back in, faint at first, like distant echoes, but growing louder with every step. They weren't words anymore. They were feelings, raw and overwhelming, fear, hunger, desperation, all swirling together in a relentless tide that threatened to drown me. Mark was the first to stumble, his flashlight clattering to the ground as he fell to his knees. I can't, he gasped, his voice cracking as he clutched his head. "It's too much." Rachel stopped to help him, her own flashlight shaking as she knelt beside him. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice strained but firm. "Whatever this is, it's not going to stop." The whispers surged, louder and more insistent, their tones overlapping and crashing together in a way that made my head throb. The object in my hand pulsed again, and I could feel something inside it, something moving, shifting, as though trying to break free. My grip tightened, my knuckles white as I forced myself to keep moving, my breath coming in shallow gasps. The tunnel opened suddenly, spilling us into another chamber, smaller but no less oppressive than the last. The walls here were smoother, their surfaces dark and reflective, like polished obsidian. The symbols carved into them glowed brighter, their spirals tighter and more chaotic, radiating a light that seemed to pulse in time with my own racing heart. In the center of the room stood a massive stone archway, its surface etched with the same intricate symbols, but they were deeper here, their edges sharp and jagged, as though carved in desperation. The air around the archway was different, thicker, heavier, as if it were alive. The whispers were louder here, their voices rising to a crescendo that filled the chamber, pressing against my thoughts and unraveling them into fragments. The archway wasn't just a structure. It was a doorway. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I stumbled back, my flashlight beam shaking as I swept it across the room. The air grew colder still, and I could feel the thing we'd seen before, the massive, shifting shadow, moving closer. It was behind us now, its growl low and resonant, vibrating through the stone beneath my feet. Julie stepped toward the archway, her movements slow and hesitant. "It's a way out," she said, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "It has to be." But I wasn't so sure. The archway didn't feel like an escape. It felt like an invitation. The object in my hand pulsed again, harder this time, and I felt a sharp pain shoot through my arm, spreading outward like fire. I gasped, nearly dropping it, but the moment my fingers loosened, the pain stopped. The whispers surged in response, their tones frantic and pleading, pulling at me with a desperation that made my head spin. "It's reacting to that thing," Rachel said, her voice sharp with fear as she pointed to the object in my hand. "Whatever it is, it's connected." I didn't want to think about what that meant. The object was warm now, almost hot, and I could feel it throbbing against my palm, its rhythm sensing with the pulsing light from the symbols on the walls. The archway seemed to respond as well, its edges glowing brighter, the air around it rippling like heat waves. And then the growl came again, louder, closer, shaking the chamber and sending cracks racing across the walls. The shadows around us twisted and stretched, their edges sharp and jagged, moving with a deliberate malice that made my stomach churn. The thing wasn't just behind us anymore. It was here. One of the shadows lashed out, a tendril of darkness that struck the ground just inches from Rachel, sending a spray of stone and dust into the air. She screamed, scrambling back as the tendril reared up, its edges glowing faintly with the same sickly light as the symbols. Another tendril followed, then another, each one writhing and twisting as they reached for us, their movements slow but deliberate. Julie grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the archway. "It's the only way," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the whispers and the growl. My legs moved on their own, my body driven forward by a force I couldn't explain, the object in my hand growing hotter with every step. The closer we got to the archway, the more the air seemed to vibrate, the pressure building until it felt like my chest might collapse under the weight of it. The shadows were relentless, their tendrils lashing out, striking the ground and the walls, their movements growing faster and more chaotic. Julie was the first to reach the archway, her hand outstretched as she stepped through. The moment she crossed the threshold, the light flared, blinding and searing, and the whispers stopped. The chamber was silent for a brief, agonizing moment, the air heavy with anticipation. And then the archway roared to life, its symbols flaring brighter than ever as the shadows surged forward, their tendrils snapping toward us like living chains. I felt the object in my hand pulse one final time, and the world exploded into light. The light wasn't just blinding, it was consuming. It burned through my vision, white-hot and searing, until I could no longer tell if my eyes were open or closed. The whispers were gone, replaced by a low, resonant hum that reverberated through my chest and rattled my teeth. The ground beneath my feet seemed to disappear, and for a moment I felt weightless, untethered from the world, floating in an endless void. And then the light was gone. I hit the ground hard, the air forced from my lungs as the cold, jagged stone scraped against my hands and knees. My flashlight had been lost somewhere in the chaos, but the room wasn't dark. The symbols on the walls pulsed faintly, their light uneven and flickering, casting long, distorted shadows that moved and stretched as though they had lives of their own. The air was heavier here, thick with the stench of decay, and something sharper, metallic, that coated the back of my throat. Julie was lying a few feet away, her body curled in on itself, her breaths coming in short, shallow gasps. Rachel and Mark were nowhere to be seen. I pushed myself to my feet, every muscle in my body trembling, and stumbled toward Julie, my hands shaking as I reached for her shoulder. "Julie," I whispered, my voice hoarse and unsteady. She didn't respond at first, her eyes wide and unfocused as she stared at the pulsing walls. I shook her gently, and she blinked, her gaze snapping to mine. "We're not out," she said, her voice trembling. "We're still here." I didn't need her to tell me that. The oppressive weight in the air, the faint hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves, the symbols glowing faintly like dying embers, it all felt wrong, unnatural. The archway had been a doorway, but it hadn't led us to safety. It had brought us deeper. The ground beneath us trembled suddenly, a faint, rhythmic vibration that grew stronger with each passing second. The light from the symbols flared, casting the room into sharp relief, and I saw it. The tendrils of shadow, curling and twisting along the edges of the chamber, moving toward us like predators closing in on their prey. The thing hadn't been left behind. It was still with us. Julie grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she pulled me toward the far side of the room. "We have to keep moving," she said, her voice sharp and urgent. I didn't argue. My legs felt like lead, every step a struggle, but the fear driving me forward was stronger than the exhaustion threatening to drag me down. The chamber opened into another tunnel, narrower and darker than the ones we'd come through before. The air here was colder, the metallic tang sharper, almost suffocating. The whispers returned, faint at first, like a distant murmur threading through the silence, but they grew louder with every step, their tones rising and falling in a chaotic, maddening rhythm. The object in my hand pulsed again, its heat intensifying, and I realized I was still holding it. Its surface was slick and warm, almost alive, and I could feel something moving within it, shifting and writhing like a trapped insect. I wanted to let it go, to throw it into the darkness and run, but my fingers wouldn't obey. It felt fused to my palm, a part of me now, and the thought sent a wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. Julie stumbled beside me, her flashlight beam bouncing erratically along the walls. The symbols were different here, their patterns more erratic, their spirals tighter, almost frantic. They pulsed in time with the whispers, their glow flickering like a dying flame. The tunnel twisted and turned, narrowing further until we were forced to crouch, the walls pressing in on all sides, the cold, slick stone scraping against my skin. And then we heard it, the growl, low and resonant, vibrating through the tunnel like a living thing, growing louder and closer with every second. The shadows moved with it, sliding along the walls, their edges sharp and jagged, their shapes shifting and stretching in ways that made my head spin. The thing wasn't just following us. It was hunting us. The tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller and more confined, the air so thick it felt like I was breathing through water. The walls were smooth and dark, their surfaces reflecting the faint glow of the symbols that spiraled toward the center of the room. There, on a raised platform of jagged stone, was another pedestal. This one was larger than the others, its surface carved with intricate, chaotic patterns that seemed to shift and move when I looked at them too long. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo as I stepped toward the pedestal, the object in my hand growing hotter, its pulses faster, more frantic. I could feel the thing behind us, its presence pressing against my back like a cold wind, but I couldn't look away from the pedestal. It was pulling me forward, the light from the symbols burning brighter, casting sharp, flickering shadows across the room. Julie grabbed my arm again, her voice breaking as she shouted, "What are you doing?" I didn't know. My legs moved on their own, my hand rising as though guided by an unseen force. The object pulsed one final time, and then the pain hit, a sharp, searing heat that shot up my arm and spread through my chest, burning through my veins like fire. I gasped, stumbling forward, and the object fell from my hand, landing on the pedestal with a hollow, echoing thud. The reaction was immediate. The symbols flared brighter than ever, their light blinding and searing, and the ground beneath us shook violently, sending cracks racing up the walls. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deafening roar that filled the chamber, a sound so deep and resonant it felt like it was tearing the air apart. The thing behind us shrieked, its tendrils lashing out, but they never reached us. The light from the pedestal surged, filling the room with a blinding brilliance, and the tendrils recoiled, twisting and writhing as they were consumed. The air grew hotter, the hum rising into a piercing wail. And then everything stopped. The light faded, the ground stilled, and the whispers were gone. The chamber was silent, the air heavy with the scent of burning, the symbols on the walls dimming to faint, flickering embers. I collapsed to my knees, my chest heaving, my body trembling as the weight of what had just happened pressed down on me. Julie knelt beside me, her face pale and streaked with tears. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I wanted to say yes, to tell her we were safe, but I couldn't. Deep in the silence, beneath the stillness, I could feel it, something vast and ancient, waiting just beyond the edges of my perception. It wasn't over. Not yet. I never should have answered that letter. It arrived on an otherwise ordinary morning, a thin, cream-colored envelope wedged under the front door of my apartment, its edges damp and smudged as though it had been dropped in some filthy, forgotten alley. There was no stamp, no return address, just my name written in looping cursive across the front, the kind of handwriting you'd expect to see carved into gravestones. My stomach tightened as I tore it open, like some part of me already knew. This was no simple invitation. The paper inside was unnaturally smooth, the ink glistening faintly even in the dim light filtering through my blinds. Your presence has been requested for an exclusive journey, a night to unravel what lies beyond the veil. Wanderlux invites you, one of the chosen few, to discover the undiscovered. Beneath the words, an address was scribbled hastily, a location outside of Boston, deep in the middle of nowhere. The signature read only, "Come as you are." I shouldn't have gone. I know that now. The mansion stood alone on a hilltop, its shadow stretching across the brittle yellow grass like a scar. It wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon. You either knew it was there, or someone, something, brought you to it. By the time I'd killed the engine, the sky had darkened to a dirty bruise, and a sharp wind rattled the skeletal trees lining the drive. The house itself looked impossibly old, its stone walls mottled with black stains that crawled like veins toward the jagged roofline. A set of massive double doors loomed at the top of the stairs, the brass handles dull and tarnished as if no living hand had touched them in years. The others were already there. 5 cars, scattered like toys on the gravel. All different makes and models, from beat-up junkers to sleek, expensive sedans. No lights, no sounds. It was as if the house swallowed everything, even time itself. I shoved the letter into my coat pocket, my fingers numb against its slick edges, and stepped out of the car. My boots crunched against the gravel, but the sound seemed wrong, muted, hollow, like footsteps echoing in a dream. I climbed the stairs and pressed my palm against the door. For just a second, I thought I felt something pulse against my skin. A heartbeat. The door opened with a groan that seemed to scrape at my bones. The air inside was stale and freezing, heavy with a smell I couldn't quite place, something sour, metallic, like rusted iron. I stepped over the threshold, the darkness swallowing me whole. For a moment, I stood still, straining to see or hear anything. My breath came in uneven bursts, misting in the cold. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a sound like nails on glass cut through the silence. Slow, deliberate. I turned toward the noise, and my foot hit something soft. A rug. No, not a rug. My chest tightened as I looked down. A coat. A long black coat, sprawled across the floor as if someone had just slipped out of it. I knelt, hesitantly, my shaking fingers brushing against the fabric. It was still warm. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't alone. A light flickered on, barely a sputtering glow, somewhere farther down the hall, casting sickly shadows that seemed to bend and slither. I stood and moved toward it, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn around and run. But something about the house wouldn't let me leave. My legs moved of their own accord, my heartbeat drumming loud enough to drown out the silence. The light came from an open doorway. The room beyond was massive, a grand dining hall lined with decaying portraits that seemed to watch me as I passed. In the center of the room was a long table draped in white cloth, immaculate and untouched, as though set for some elaborate feast. 10 chairs sat perfectly aligned, their backs curved like broken spines. 9 of the chairs were empty. The 10th was not. A man slumped forward, his face hidden against the tablecloth. His fingers, long and pale, like something carved from wax, gripped the edges of his plate. I took a step closer, my throat dry, bile rising. The back of his head was wrong. The skin there was smooth and seamless, as though his skull had been melted into a featureless mass. A sound escaped me, a strangled, half-sob, and I stumbled back, my shoulder colliding with a chair. The impact rattled the table, and I watched in horror as the man's fingers twitched. He moved. Slowly, impossibly, he lifted his head. I couldn't breathe. His face, if you could call it that, was stretched and hollow, his eyes empty sockets that seemed to look right through me. His jaw unhinged, lips peeling back as though to scream, but no sound came. Only a terrible, echoing silence that filled my ears and pressed against my skull. I turned and ran. The hallways twisted and shifted as I sprinted blindly through the house, my pulse hammering in my ears. Doors appeared where there had been none before. Shadows swelled and stretched across the walls, keeping pace with me like a pack of starving dogs. At last, I stumbled into the foyer, the double doors still open, moonlight spilling in like a cruel joke. I hurled myself through them, tumbling down the stone steps, gravel biting into my palms as I crawled toward my car. The others were there. I froze, my chest heaving. 5 figures stood beside their cars, motionless, watching me. I couldn't see their faces, not in the darkness, but I knew. They weren't the same people who'd driven here. Their bodies were stiff and wrong, their heads tilting at impossible angles as they took slow, synchronized steps toward me. I scrambled to my feet and staggered toward my car, fumbling for the keys. My hands were shaking too hard to hold on to them. One dropped to the ground, clinking softly against the gravel. I turned to grab it, and for the briefest second, I saw their feet, bare, filthy, the skin peeling away in places like old leather. A cold hand clamped around my wrist. I looked up and saw the man from the dining room. His hollow face loomed inches from mine, those empty sockets still searching for something. My scream died in my throat as the world tilted and the shadow swallowed me whole. Here's the continuation, seamlessly picking up from where Chapter 1 ended, maintaining the tension, eerie atmosphere, and immersive first-person perspective. I woke up to the sound of my own breath, ragged, shallow, scraping against the cold air like sandpaper. I was lying face down, cheek pressed against something rough and freezing. Grovel. The scent of wet dirt filled my nose, metallic and sour. My body felt heavy, as if my limbs were weighed down by stones. I tried to move, and a sharp pain shot through my wrist where, no, that hand, that cold, unnatural hand. My eyes flew open, and I jerked upright. The mansion loomed in the distance, silhouetted against the darkened sky like a jagged tombstone. I wasn't on the driveway anymore. The gravel beneath me was scattered, uneven, and surrounded by fields of scorched, lifeless earth. Everything was so quiet. No wind, no rustling trees. Just silence, heavy and watching. I swallowed hard, my throat aching. Where were the others? I spun around, searching, and my breath caught. A single figure stood far ahead, just on the edge of my vision. It wasn't moving. From this distance, it looked like a statue, a thin, black shape against the gray horizon. My fingers curled into fists as I hesitated, every instinct in my body telling me to run in the opposite direction. But something in the back of my mind whispered, "What choice do you have?" With every step toward the figure, the world around me seemed to warp, as if the air itself was thickening, resisting my movements. My shoes sank into the earth, each step accompanied by an awful, sucking sound, like boots pulled from deep mud. And then I saw it, etched into the dirt beneath my feet. Letters. Names. They were carved haphazardly into the earth, some so faded they seemed decades old. I stopped and knelt, brushing my fingers across the nearest name, Samuel Reed. The letters were uneven, desperate, as though someone had scratched them in with their bare hands. Below it, another name, smaller, Ellen Pierce. And then more, hundreds, maybe thousands, overlapping each other like scars. I staggered back, nearly falling. The figure in the distance hadn't moved. "Who are you?" I croaked, my voice breaking against the silence. No answer. I started forward again, my pulse pounding in my ears. The closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't a statue at all. It was a man. A tall, gaunt man in a black coat, standing motionless, his back to me. He didn't move, not even when I was close enough to hear the faint whistle of his breathing. I reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. His head snapped around. I stumbled back, choking on a scream. His face was gray and stretched, skin pulled tight over sharp cheekbones. His mouth hung open, slack and empty, but his eyes, God, those eyes, were gone. Two black holes stared back at me, endless and empty, the darkness inside them swirling like ink dropped in water. And then he smiled. It wasn't a natural smile. It was too wide, too wrong, teeth jagged and yellowed, splitting the gray skin of his face as if it might tear in two. "Run," he whispered. I ran. The earth cracked beneath my feet as I sprinted, the scorched ground splitting open to reveal something darker beneath, something moving. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My chest burned, my lungs clawing for air as I pushed myself forward, praying for anything. An end to the silence, a road, even the mansion again. And then I heard it. A low rumbling sound, deep and constant, growing louder with every step I took. It shook the air, rattling my bones, vibrating through the soles of my feet. A voice, impossibly loud, seemed to rise from the cracks in the ground, speaking words I couldn't understand. The sound became overwhelming, drilling into my skull, until I stumbled onto pavement. The transition was so sudden, it felt like stepping from one world into another. I fell to my knees, my hands scraping against cracked asphalt. Slowly, I lifted my head. I was standing in the middle of a road. Not just any road, this was different. It stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into a haze of shimmering heat. No signs, no cars, just miles and miles of black, broken pavement. The rumbling had stopped. I turned slowly, my heart still pounding. Behind me was the field of scorched earth, the mansion just a dark smudge in the distance. And ahead, a single sign stood crooked by the side of the road, the paint on its surface worn and flaking. I squinted, reading the faded letters. Welcome to Centralia. Centralia. The word rattled something loose in my mind, like a memory half remembered. A town that burned. A place people whispered about in documentaries and local legends. The underground coal fires, they said, had turned it into a ghost town, smoke rising from cracks in the earth, streets caving in without warning. A place no one lived. But they were wrong. Because as I stood there, trembling, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them scattered along the road and the hillsides, just standing. Their backs were to me, their bodies still as statues, faces turned toward the horizon. Some of them looked wrong, bent at impossible angles, arms too long, necks twisted. Others were almost normal, but their stillness, there was something awful about it, like mannequins abandoned in the sun. I took a step back. My heel scraped against the pavement, and the sound, just that single noise, sent every head snapping toward me. They weren't mannequins. Their faces were stretched and hollow, empty sockets staring without blinking, mouths hanging open in silence. As one, they turned their bodies, moving jerkily, like marionettes on tangled strings. I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. The heat from the road swirled in waves around me, and the figures began to move, their footsteps perfectly synchronized. The silence broke. A low, droning hum began to rise from the earth, deeper than before, vibrating through my chest. The figures marched forward, their faces locked on mine, their mouths opening wider and wider, as if preparing to swallow me whole. I turned and ran again, down the center of the cracked, burning road, with nowhere to hide and no one to save me. The last thing I heard before the darkness came was the sound of my own name, whispered on the wind. I didn't know how long I ran. Time had unraveled into something meaningless. The road stretched endlessly ahead of me, cracked and broken, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. My throat was raw, each breath scraping against the back of my ribs, like shards of glass. Sweat pooled at the base of my spine, sticking my clothes to my skin, but no matter how far I went, the figures followed, silent, unrelenting. When I finally stopped, it wasn't because I was safe. It was because the road had ended. It just stopped. A jagged line of pavement gave way to nothing but black dirt, stretching endlessly into the horizon. My legs trembled as I doubled over, hands on my knees, choking back bile. Behind me, the figures stood motionless at the road's edge, their hollow eyes fixed on me. They didn't cross. They didn't need to. They knew there was nowhere for me to go. I turned back to face the void, and then I saw it. A bridge. It rose up out of the darkness like a bone, pale and decayed, its surface littered with weeds and dead vines. The supports were crooked, as though the bridge itself had been twisted by some terrible force. A sign dangled from the rusted railing at the entrance, swaying faintly in the still air. I squinted to read the faded letters, though something inside me already knew what it would say. Crybaby Bridge. The name slammed into me like a punch to the chest. I had heard the stories. Everyone had. A bridge in the middle of nowhere where terrible things had happened, unspeakable things. A place where, if you stopped in the dead of night, you could hear the cries of the lost. Some said it was a baby. Others claimed it was something much worse. A warning, a lure. No one could ever agree. But here it was, and I was the only one standing before it. The air grew colder as I stepped onto the bridge. The boards creaked beneath my weight, the sound echoing off the darkness that stretched below. I couldn't see the water, if there was any, but I could hear it. A slow, deliberate dripping, as though something unseen was waiting just out of sight. My footsteps quickened, but no matter how fast I moved, the other end of the bridge seemed impossibly far away. And then I heard it. At first I thought it was the wind, soft, whispering, curling around my ears like smoke. But it wasn't. It was crying. The sound rose up slowly from beneath the bridge, muffled and wet, like someone sobbing underwater. It seeped into my ears, settling behind my eyes, growing louder with every step I took. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the other side, but the sound burrowed deeper, like it wanted me to hear. "Stop," I whispered to myself. My voice was barely a rasp. "It's not real. Keep moving." But it was real, because the sobbing turned into a scream. A shriek so sharp and shrill it felt like needles driving into my skull. I dropped to my knees, hands clamping over my ears as the sound split the air around me. It was everywhere, inside me, like the bridge itself was wailing. And beneath the scream, something else. Footsteps, slow and deliberate. I looked up. A figure stood halfway across the bridge, bathed in the dim, sickly light that seemed to come from nowhere. It was small, barely 4 feet tall, and hunched, its body shrouded in a tattered white cloth that dragged behind it like a funeral shroud. Its head twitched violently, like a puppet caught on tangled strings. I tried to stand, but my legs wouldn't obey. The figure took a step forward. The scream stopped. Silence slammed down like a physical weight, leaving only the faint sound of dripping water beneath the bridge. My ears rang, my pulse pounding against the base of my skull as I forced myself to my feet. I backed away, my hands outstretched as if I could somehow ward it off. "Stay back," I croaked. The figure didn't stop. It moved toward me with jerky, unnatural motions, its limbs snapping at odd angles. As it stepped into the light, the cloth slipped from its face. It was a child, or something that used to be a child. Its skin was pale and waxy, stretched too tight over a skull that seemed the wrong shape, the wrong size. Black hollows gaped where its eyes should have been, its mouth a torn slit that widened as it took another step. A sound escaped its throat, a choking, wheezing sob, and I realized it wasn't crying. It was laughing. I turned and ran. The bridge shook beneath me, the boards splintering as I sprinted for the far end. The laughter followed me, rising and twisting, echoing off the darkness below. My shoes slipped against the rotted wood, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel it, feel her, right behind me, reaching, clawing, laughing. The far end of the bridge finally appeared ahead of me, the rusted railing just a few feet away. I hurled myself toward it, lungs burning, my vision blurring at the edges. My fingers caught the railing, metal biting into my palms as I skidded to a stop. I spun around, gasping for breath. The bridge was empty. The child was gone. The laughter had stopped, leaving only the silence, thick and suffocating. I turned back toward the road beyond the bridge, stumbling forward. The landscape was empty now, the black dirt stretching endlessly ahead. But as I moved, I felt it again, that awful sensation of being watched. And when I looked down at my hands, I saw it, dark stains smeared across my fingers, slick and warm. Blood, dyed. But it wasn't mine. I wiped my hands against my jeans, my movements frantic and shaky, but the stains wouldn't fade. They only spread, soaking into the fabric, like ink on paper. My breaths came in shallow bursts as I staggered onward, my eyes fixed on the empty horizon. The road had no end, and somewhere behind me, just beyond the bridge, the laughter started again. The road didn't end. It only twisted, stretched, and became something else entirely. I walked for what felt like hours, or days. Time didn't work right anymore. The world beyond the horizon blurred and shimmered like heat waves rising from scorched pavement, but there was no sun, No light. Just an endless smear of gray. The blood on my hands had dried by now, crusting into black veins along the creases of my skin. No matter how hard I scrubbed, no matter how raw my knuckles turned, it wouldn't go away. My footsteps echoed against nothing, a sound that shouldn't have existed. And then I saw it, something looming ahead of me, emerging from the horizon like a nightmare returning to life. It was a building. No, a prison. Its walls rose high, jagged and skeletal, like bones sharpened to points. Towers jutted into the sky, their silhouettes black and gnarled, as if they were rotting from the inside. The closer I got, the colder the air became. My breath misted in front of me, curling into shapes that lingered too long before fading. The gates were open, wide and welcoming, and for a long moment I stood still, my body vibrating with dread. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't have a choice. The entrance swallowed me whole. The air within was thicker, heavier, pressing against my chest like a pair of hands. I stumbled forward, my shoes scraping against stone. The place smelled of mildew and rot, and something worse beneath it all. Something sharp and metallic. The walls were lined with cells, stretching infinitely into darkness. Rusted bars stood like ribs, their shadows splayed across the floor in jagged patterns. I stepped cautiously down the center of the hall, my head swiveling from side to side, scanning for movement. There was no light here, no windows, no lamps, but I could see somehow. A faint, sickly glow pulsed from somewhere deeper within, casting everything in hues of gray and black. And then I heard them. Whispers. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The sound tickled the edges of my ears just faint enough to make me doubt it was real. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. Soft, insidious murmurs rising from the shadows. Voices. Too many voices. I stopped in my tracks, my skin crawling. They were saying my name. I turned to the nearest cell, my heart hammering. The bars were empty, the shadows deep and unbroken. But something was there. I could feel it. The air was heavier here, pressing against me like a weight. I stepped closer, fingers trembling as I reached out to touch the bars. A face lunged forward, slamming against the rusted iron. I screamed and staggered back, my hands flying to my mouth. The figure behind the bars was impossible to make out. A smear of pale skin and hollow eyes, its mouth gaping open in a silent scream. Its fingers curled around the bars, nails blackened and splintered, scraping faintly against the metal. It wasn't just this cell. I looked up, and my stomach dropped. Every cell was occupied now. Figures stood motionless behind the bars, their bodies slumped and broken, their faces twisted into masks of suffering. They stared at me, hundreds of them, eyes wide and empty, their mouths moving in soundless unison. I could see their breath fogging the air, cold and heavy, though they made no sound. And then one of them stepped out. The door to the nearest cell creaked open, the rusted hinges shrieking. A man staggered forward, his movements unnatural, jerky, like a puppet with half its strings cut. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunk in pits, but there was something familiar about him. He looked like me. He lifted his head, his mouth twitching as though he were trying to smile. "You don't belong here," he whispered. My blood turned to ice. "Who are you?" He didn't answer. He only tilted his head, a strange mechanical movement, and gestured deeper into the prison. My body refused to move, every nerve screaming at me to run, but my feet stepped forward anyway, dragging me deeper into the dark. The whispers followed me, growing louder, clearer. They weren't voices anymore. They were accusations. "You let us in. You did this. We're still here because of you." I clamped my hands over my ears, stumbling through the darkness as the words burrowed into my skull. "Shut up!" I screamed. "Leave me alone." The voices laughed. a low, guttural sound that echoed through the stone walls, rattling my teeth. I don't know how long I walked before I reached the door. It was massive, taller than any doorway I'd ever seen, carved from iron and etched with words I couldn't read. The glow was brighter here, spilling from beneath the seams like firelight. The whispers were louder now, overlapping each other into a deafening roar. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the door. The metal was ice cold beneath my palm, burning my skin, but I couldn't pull away. Slowly, the door groaned open, and the light beyond it swallowed me whole. I was standing in a circular chamber. The walls were covered in mirrors, dozens of them, all cracked and blackened around the edges. They reflected nothing. Not me. Not the room. Just darkness. And then, one by one, the mirrors began to shift. Shapes appeared within them, writhing like insects beneath glass. Faces. My face, over and over, twisted in agony, screaming soundlessly. I staggered back, my chest heaving as the reflections turned their empty eyes toward me. The whispers became words again. This time, it was my own voice. You can't hide from yourself. The mirrors shattered all at once. Shards exploded outward, flying toward me like razors. I threw my arms up to shield my face, but it was no use. They cut into me, my skin, my clothes, slicing deep. Pain bloomed through me, white hot and blinding. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the cold stone floor. The room was gone. The mirrors were gone. And I was alone. But the blood was still there. It dripped from my fingertips onto the stone, dark and endless. My reflection stared back at me from the surface of the blood. Not broken, not hollow, but smiling. And the smile wasn't mine. The road seemed to stretch into infinity, the cracked asphalt disappearing into a horizon that never grew closer. My legs ached, each step heavier than the last. The silence was absolute, no wind, no sound, just me, the vast emptiness and the smear. Then I saw the lights. They started as faint pinpricks far ahead, flickering against the dim horizon. At first I thought they were headlights, maybe a car, another person, something. But they moved to me. I stopped, frozen in place. My chest tight. The hum came next. A low buzzing vibration in the air, faint at first, but growing louder, resonating deep in my bones. I covered my ears instinctively, but it didn't help. It wasn't a sound I was hearing. It feeling. I turned to run, my heartbeat kua. But the lights follow. They moved faster now, streaking through the sky like fireflies caught in a storm. I sprinted down the road, my feet pounding against the cracked asphalt, sweat dripping down the back of my neck. The hum grew sharper, clawing at the edges of my thoughts, pushing out everything else. My vision swam, the world spinning around me. And then, it appeared ahead of me, rising out of the haze like a mirage. A gas station. Small, rundown, its neon sign flickering weakly above the entrance. The letters were worn and crooked, but it was shelter. Somewhere to hide. I stumbled toward it, the hum pressing against my skull like a vice. The lights were right behind me now, their glow hot against my back. My hands fumbled with the door, yanking it open, and I fell inside. The bell above the entrance let out a shrill ding that seemed to cut through the sound, and then silence. The humming stopped. I lay on the floor for a moment, gasping for breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The linoleum beneath me was cold and sticky, littered with dirt and dried leaves. Slowly, I pushed myself upright, my eyes darting around the room. The gas station was empty. Rows of dusty shelves stretched before me, their contents faded and forgotten. Bags of chips long past their expiration date, soda bottles coated in grime. The flickering fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, bathing everything in a pale, sickly glow. It felt wrong. I stepped forward, the sound of my shoes squeaking against the floor far too loud. My gaze moved toward the counter at the back of the store, where a figure sat slumped behind a register. "Hello?" I called out, my voice hoarse. The figure didn't move. I hesitated, every instinct in me screaming to stay away, but I forced my feet forward. My hands trembled as I reached out to tap the man's shoulder. "Hey!" A loud clatter rang out from behind me. I spun around, my heart slamming against my chest. A bottle had fallen from one of the shelves, rolling lazily across the floor until it stopped with a dull thud. The lights overhead flickered more erratically now, buzzing louder. The air grew colder. I turned back toward the counter, but the figure was gone. The chair sat empty, creaking faintly as it swayed back and forth. I stumbled back a step, my pulse roaring in my ears. I wasn't alone here. A soft sound broke the silence, like whispering, faint and distant, rising from somewhere deeper in the store. I turned toward the sound, my breath hitching. The doorway at the far end of the gas station stood open now, leading to a hallway that shouldn't have been there. The light beyond it pulsed faintly, as though something was waiting. The whispers grew louder, curling through the air like smoke, their words just beyond my understanding. I didn't want to go, but my legs moved anyway. The hallway was long and narrow, the walls peeling and stained, the light overhead flickering with every step I took. I kept my eyes forward, refusing to look at the shadows pooling in the corners of my vision. The whispers followed me, growing clearer the farther I went. When I reached the end of the hallway, I stopped. There was a door, old and wooden, its surface covered in scratches, dozens of them, overlapping, deep, and desperate. My hand moved toward the doorknob, shaking, the whispers now a low chorus filling the air. I turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. It was a room, small and empty, with walls made of glass. On the other side of the glass stood them, the lights, the shadows, twisting, flickering figures that moved like smoke, their outlines blurring and reforming with every breath I took. They crowded the edges of the glass, their movements synchronized, their heads tilting in perfect unison. And then, one of them stepped closer. Its form solidified as it approached, growing clearer. The longer I stared, the more I realized it was taking shape, becoming something familiar. It looked like me. It stopped just inches from the glass, its face a perfect mirror of my own. But its expression was wrong, its smile too wide, its eyes empty, its head tilting ever so slightly to one side. It raised a hand, pressing its palm flat against the glass. I stared as my own hand moved involuntarily, lifting to match its position. The glass was ice cold beneath my fingertip. The whispers stopped. The figure smiled wider, and then the glass cracked. Lines spider-webbed outward from where our hands met, splintering like veins. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat as the cracks spread faster, deeper, the sound of shattering glass echoing through the room. And then the glass exploded. I threw my arms up to shield myself as shards rained down, cutting through the air with a high-pitched wail. The light beyond the glass flared, blinding and white, and I felt myself falling, the ground vanishing beneath me, the air rushing past as I tumbled into the void. And then, nothing. Just silence. When I came to, I was lying on a cold marble floor. The smooth surface pressed against my cheek, freezing and wet, like stone in the middle of winter. My head ached, throbbing behind my eyes like something was trying to claw its way out, and every muscle in my body felt heavy and useless. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was or how I'd gotten there. Then, the whispers returned. Soft at first, like a breeze winding its way through cracks in an old house. Then louder, closer, until they seemed to pour from the walls themselves. I opened my eyes. I was inside a room. No, a mansion. Its ceiling stretched impossibly high above me, draped in cobwebs that clung to enormous chandeliers. Blackened, Peeling wallpaper curled away from the walls like burnt skin, and the faint scent of decay filled the air, mingling with something sharper, something almost sweet. A massive staircase curved upward into shadow, its banister worn smooth, as though countless hands had dragged across it over centuries. I pushed myself upright, my hands slipping against the slick marble. As I stood, I noticed the stains beneath me, dark smears that soaked into the stone, spreading out like roots. My stomach turned, and I forced my gaze upward. The room was filled with mirrors. They lined the walls, stretching floor to ceiling, hundreds of them, side by side. Each one was cracked, the glass fractured into webs of splinters that distorted the reflections within. I stared at my own reflection nearest to me, pale, filthy, my face hollow and gaunt. But something was wrong. My reflection wasn't moving. I froze. My chest tightened as I lifted my hand. The figure in the glass didn't mimic me. It just stood there, watching, its empty eyes fixed on mine. A shiver crawled down my spine, and I turned sharply away. "Don't look at them." The whispers grew louder now, rippling through the air like waves. I turned toward the massive staircase. It was the only way out. My footsteps echoed as I climbed, the sound muffled somehow, like the house itself was swallowing it. Each step creaked beneath me, groaning under my weight. The higher I climbed, the darker it became. Shadows pooled against the walls, stretching and bending in ways that didn't make sense. At the top of the staircase, a long hallway stretched before me, lined with tall wooden doors. None of them were labeled. None of them looked inviting. I moved toward the nearest door. As I gripped the handle, the whispers stopped. For a moment, everything was still. My heartbeat slowed, the silence pressing against me like a weight. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was small, lit by a single flickering bulb that swung slowly from the ceiling. Dust swirled in the light, settling on furniture that had been draped in white sheets. A faint hum filled the space, like static from an old television, growing louder as I stepped inside. In the center of the room sat a chair. Someone was sitting in it. I stopped in my tracks, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and leave. The figure in the chair was slumped forward, arms dangling at its sides, its head bowed so low I couldn't see its face. Something about the posture seemed wrong, unnatural, like the body had been left there, forgotten. And then it moved. Slowly, its head tilted upward. My breath caught in my throat as I saw its face, my face. Pale and hollow, its skin stretched tight over sharp bones. It blinked once, slowly, and then smiled. I stumbled back, my shoulder hitting the doorframe. "No, you're not me." The thing in the chair stood. Its movements were jerky, like it was unused to the weight of its own body. It took a step toward me, its smile widening, and I felt something sharp stab at the back of my skull, a feeling like falling into cold water, breathless and drowning. "Leave me alone." I choked, forcing myself to move. I turned and bolted into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. The whispers returned in an instant, louder than ever now, screaming through the walls. I staggered forward, clutching my ears, my vision swimming. The lights overhead flickered erratically, casting the hallway in sharp bursts of shadow. I reached another door, bigger this time, its wood splintered and rotting. I shoved it open and stumbled inside. The room beyond was a ballroom, massive and empty. The chandeliers overhead were shattered, their glass littering the floor like frozen rain. The walls were lined with towering windows, but the view beyond them was wrong. Instead of the outside world, there was only darkness, vast and endless, pressing against the glass as though it wanted to get in. And then I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them. They stood scattered across the ballroom, their backs to me, motionless. They were dressed in old tattered clothes, formal gowns and suits, as though they'd been frozen in the middle of a party that had ended long ago. One of them twitched. I stepped backward, my shoe crunching against a shard of glass. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. Every figure turned toward me in unison. Their faces were blank, featureless. They began to move, their footsteps slow and deliberate, glass crunching underfoot as they advanced. The static hum filled the room again, rising to a roar that made my teeth vibrate. I turned and ran, slipping across the glass, my breath coming in ragged bursts. The doors wouldn't open. I pounded on them, throwing my weight against the wood, but it was no use. I turned, my back to the door, as the figures closed in. Their featureless heads tilted to the side, their movements slow and methodical, like they had all the time in the world. The hum grew louder, shaking the room. The glass in the windows began to splinter, cracks spreading outward like spiderwebs. The darkness beyond pulsed and moved, pressing harder against the glass, as though it was alive, waiting. And then the windows shattered. The room erupted into chaos as the darkness poured inside, flooding the ballroom like a living thing. I was engulfed in it, smothered, blinded, weightless, as the hum swallowed everything, vibrating through me until I felt myself breaking apart. I screamed, but there was no sound. There was only the dark. The darkness swallowed me whole. It was everywhere, around me, inside me, a suffocating void pressing against my skin like damp fabric. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. It was as though I'd fallen into something far deeper than water, my body weightless but heavy at the same time, sinking endlessly. And then, just as suddenly, I felt ground beneath me. I gasped, my lungs filling with stale air that burned like smoke. My palms pressed against something cold and smooth, marble again. I pushed myself up, the darkness clinging to me like oil before it began to peel away, evaporating into thin wisps. When I opened my eyes, I was back inside the mansion. The ballroom was gone. I was in the foyer again, at the foot of the massive staircase, as though the house had folded back in on itself. The cracked mirrors lining the walls were gone. The light that filtered in through the filthy windows was dull and gray, as if the sun outside had been smothered. And I wasn't alone. They stood at the top of the staircase. The figures. 5 of them. I didn't recognize their faces, not at first. But as they took slow, synchronized steps downward, the details came into focus, and something inside me twisted. Their features were familiar, horribly so. They were the other guests, the strangers I had seen back at the beginning, when this nightmare first began. But they weren't right. Their skin was waxy and pale, their eyes hollow, their movements stiff and unnatural, like dolls moved by invisible strings. They walked in unison, heads tilted just slightly, their expressions blank, except for their mouths. Each of them wore a faint, unnatural smile, a smile that didn't belong on a living person. I backed up, my heart pounding in my ears. "What do you want?" I croaked. My voice barely sounded like my own anymore, hoarse, broken. The figures didn't answer. They just kept coming, step by step, their shoes tapping faintly against the wood. I turned, desperate, and ran for the front doors. My hands slammed against them, wrenching at the handles, pulling with every ounce of strength I had left. Locked. Déjà. Of course they were locked. Behind me, the footsteps stopped. I turned slowly. The figures stood still now, just a few feet away. They'd formed a semicircle around me, their faces frozen in those awful identical smiles. My chest heaved as I backed against the door, my palms slick against the cold wood. And then, one by one, they spoke. Not in unison. Not together. Each of them spoke with their own voice, voices I knew. My voice. "You brought yourself here," one said, the sound coming from its throat like air forced through broken pipes. "You let it in," whispered another, its hollow eyes fixed on mine. "You can't run anymore." My hands flew to my ears, my body shaking. "Stop it! Stop talking!" But they didn't stop. The words poured out of them, low and calm, like they were simply stating a fact. The sound filled the air around me, rising in volume until it was all I could hear. My own voice coming from their mouths. My thoughts, my fears, twisted and thrown back at me. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The figures turned their heads toward the staircase, as though drawn by some invisible force. Their smiles faltered. Slowly, they stepped backward, their movements jerky and unnatural again, until they melted into the shadows pooling at the edge of the room. A new sound echoed through the house now. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from above. I turned toward the staircase, my body rigid, every nerve on edge. A figure appeared at the top, tall, impossibly thin, draped in a long black coat that seemed to move on its own, as though it were alive. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, eyes that saw everything, even the things I tried to bury. It took a step forward, and the house groaned in response. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It just lifted one hand, a pale, bony thing that stretched too far, its fingers like sharpened twigs, and pointed at me. The ground beneath me trembled. I staggered backward as cracks splintered through the marble floor, spreading outward in jagged lines. The entire house seemed to breathe, the walls warping and shifting, as though it were alive. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, like the hum I'd heard before, but deeper now, vibrating through my chest, my teeth, my bones. I looked back at the figure, and its face was no longer shrouded. It was me. Not just my face, my everything. A perfect, horrifying reflection of myself, but twisted, its expression blank and empty, its eyes black pits that swallowed the light. It smiled. "You brought yourself here," it said in my voice. The floor split open beneath me. I fell, the darkness swallowing me again, pulling me down, down, down. I screamed, but the sound disappeared into the void. And then I woke up. I was standing in the middle of an empty road. The asphalt stretched infinitely in both directions, the landscape around me flat and barren. The sky above was gray and endless, heavy with clouds that never moved. I looked down at my hands, clean now, no blood, no dirt. The hum was gone. The mansion was gone. Everything was gone. For a long moment I stood there, staring at the horizon, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was nothing. Just silence. Just me. And then, far off, in the distance, I saw a figure. Small, distant, standing perfectly still, watching. I took a step toward it, my body moving without thought. Then, another step. And another. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was me, standing there, waiting, smiling. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windshield in a relentless rhythm as my headlights sliced through the dense fog. The road beneath me was little more than a ribbon of cracked asphalt, twisting through endless miles of forest that loomed on either side, dark and oppressive. The trees seemed closer here, their branches clawing at the sky, slick with rain, like blackened bones reaching for something unseen. The letter had been simple, a plea written in shaky black ink, scrawled onto brittle paper that felt older than it should have been. "Come to Gravesmore. Help us before it's too late." That was all it said. No signature. No explanation. Just an address scribbled beneath it. 13 Hollow Lane. And now, Here I was, deep in the middle of nowhere, chasing a town that didn't appear on any map. My fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter as I glanced at the clock. 11:57 p.m. The woods on either side of me were suffocating. My high beams barely penetrated the murk, the fog swirling like smoke as though it were alive. The GPS on my phone had cut out miles back, leaving me with nothing but silence and the vague directions I'd written on a napkin. Then I saw it. A sign appeared on the side of the road, its paint chipped and weathered, the letters barely legible in the gloom. Welcome to Gravesmore. I slowed the car as I passed it, my headlights sweeping across the jagged edges of the wood, as though someone had tried to tear it down but never finished the job. The town appeared out of the fog like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The houses were old, Victorian structures with peaked roofs and darkened windows that stared down at me like watchful eyes. Many were falling apart, their shutters hanging loose, paint peeling away in strips. The streets were empty, slick with rainwater that reflected the dim glow of gas lamps spaced along the sidewalks. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though there was no one to see. My car crawled forward, the engine's low hum the only sound besides the rain. Hollow Lane wasn't hard to find. The road narrowed sharply, the houses pressing in closer, and there it was, 13 Hollow Lane. The house was a shadow. It loomed at the end of the street, set apart from the others, as though the ground itself had rejected it. The structure was tall and thin, its silhouette crooked against the night sky. The windows were black, devoid of light or life, and the front door hung slightly open, like it was waiting for me. I parked the car at the edge of the driveway, the engine shuddering as I killed it. For a moment I sat there, staring at the house through the rain-streaked windshield. The air inside the car felt heavy, pressing against my chest, as though the house itself were breathing. I stepped out into the rain, the cold biting through my coat. Gravel crunched beneath my boots as I made my way up the narrow path toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, like the ground didn't want me to move forward. I hesitated at the threshold, the darkness beyond the door so absolute it felt like I was staring into an abyss. Something moved inside. It wasn't loud, a faint shuffling sound, like footsteps on an old wooden floor, but it was enough. My breath caught as I leaned forward, straining to see through the gap in the door. There was nothing, just darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice small against the quiet. No answer. The door creaked louder than it should have as I pushed it open. The smell hit me first, damp and stale, like rotting wood and something sharper, metallic. I stepped inside, the floor groaning beneath my weight, and pulled out my flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a narrow entryway that opened into a large empty room beyond. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling in long strips to reveal wood that was warped and cracked. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste, disturbed only by the rain dripping through a hole in the ceiling. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I thought I saw something move in the corner of the room, a shadow, there and gone so fast I couldn't be sure it was real. I moved farther inside, my footsteps muffled by a threadbare rug stretched across the floor. The silence was unbearable, so complete it felt unnatural. Houses like this creaked and groaned with the wind, but here there was nothing, just me. And then I heard it, a whisper. It was faint, almost too soft to notice, but it was there, a voice drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. I turned sharply, my flashlight shaking as I pointed it toward the sound. The beam landed on a staircase. The wood was rotted, the steps sagging beneath their own weight, but it led upward, vanishing into the dark. The whisper came again, clearer now. A single word, repeated over and over in a voice that sounded wrong. "Help! Help! Help!" My feet moved before I could stop them. I climbed the stairs slowly, my flashlight tracing the walls as I went. Halfway up, I stopped. The whisper had changed. It was saying my name. Evelyn, Evelyn. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air grew colder, so cold I could see my breath fogging in front of me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming for a moment before sputtering back to life. Something was waiting for me at the top of the stairs. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with closed doors that loomed tall and narrow, their paint peeling like dead skin. The whispering had stopped, but I could feel it, something pressing against me, watching me from just beyond the edges of the light. I moved toward the nearest door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. It turned too easily, the hinges groaning softly as I pushed it open. The room beyond was empty, but the walls were covered in writing. Black symbols had been scrawled across every inch of space, looping and jagged, like they'd been carved with something sharp. In the center of the room sat a small wooden chair, and on the chair was a doll. It was old, its porcelain face cracked, its glass eyes staring straight ahead. Its mouth was painted into a faint smile, and its hands rested in its lap, as though waiting for something. Then its head moved. It turned slowly, the crackling sound of porcelain grinding against itself filling the room as its empty eyes fixed on me. My flashlight flickered again, and the whisper returned, louder this time, everywhere at once. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. I stumbled backward, slamming into the wall as the flashlight fell from my hands, spinning across the floor. The room plunged into darkness, but the whispering didn't stop. It rose into a roar, a chorus of voices overlapping and echoing through the room, as though the house itself was screaming. And then, everything went silent. The last thing I heard before the world went dark was the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming up the stairs. The footsteps creaked closer, slow, deliberate, each step drawn out just enough to set my nerves on edge. My flashlight lay useless on the floor, its beam spinning in erratic circles as it rolled, carving brief glimpses of the room from the darkness. The doll still sat in its chair, unmoving, but its presence was suffocating. I held my breath, straining to hear through the silence. The footsteps stopped at the threshold of the room. I couldn't see anything in the dark, but I felt it, something there in the doorway, watching me. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run, to move, to do something, but my legs wouldn't obey. The floor groaned, and then came the sound of breathing. Shallow, ragged breaths, like something was gasping to stay alive. I turned toward the noise, forcing my body to respond. My hand fumbled against the floor, searching for the flashlight. The light spun to a stop, and the beam landed on the doorway. There was no one there. The hallway stretched beyond the threshold, dark and empty. But I knew I wasn't alone. That feeling of being watched clung to me like a second skin, thick and heavy, pushing down on my shoulders. I grabbed the flashlight and stood, my hand trembling, as the beam cut through the dark. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice was so small, it barely sounded like mine. Nothing answered. The house was silent again. I turned back to the room, my gaze flicking to the chair. The doll was gone. The chair sat empty now, tilted just slightly to the side as though something had moved too quickly from it. My heart lurched. I swept the flashlight around the room, the beam quivering against the walls covered in their strange black symbols. The whispers began again, soft and faint, rising from somewhere I couldn't place. Evelyn, Evelyn, Evelyn. I backed into the hallway, my light shaking with every step. The sound was coming from deeper in the house. It moved through the walls, rising and falling like a chorus, growing louder with every inch I put between myself and the empty chair. The hallway stretched in both directions, longer than it had been before, the walls warping and twisting in the edges of my vision. I turned left, drawn toward a faint glow spilling through the crack of a door at the far end. It was the only light I'd seen in the house, and even though every part of me knew I shouldn't go toward it, I couldn't stop. The door opened on its own as I approached, groaning on its hinges. The room beyond was a kitchen, or what was left of one. Cabinets hung off their hinges, their paint flaking onto the floor. The countertops were littered with broken dishes and rusted utensils, the sink filled with a stagnant pool of dark water. The air here was worse, thick and humid, with a faint sour smell I couldn't place. The table in the center of the room caught my eye first. It was set for dinner, 4 plates arranged neatly, with silverware placed beside them and empty glasses waiting. But the food was wrong. The plates were covered in black sludge that oozed toward the edges like it was still alive. Flies crawled across the surface, their wings buzzing faintly in the silence. And then I noticed the figures. 4 chairs sat around the table, and in each chair sat a shape, covered completely in sheets of heavy yellowed fabric. They were slumped forward, their hands resting on their laps, their heads tilted just slightly downward. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they were watching me. The whispering grew louder now, filling the room, coming from them. Sit, sit. I stumbled backward, bumping into the edge of the counter, my flashlight flickering in my hand. One of the figures shifted. The fabric covering it sagged, a faint rustling sound spilling from underneath. Stop, I choked, my voice shaking. Please, stop. The whispering didn't stop. I turned and bolted, the flashlight swinging wildly as I crashed back into the hallway. The house groaned around me, floorboards creaking, walls rattling, as though it was alive and angry. I ran toward the stairs, my breath ragged, my hands slipping along the banister as I climbed. The whispers followed me, rising into a roar that seemed to crawl inside my head, into my bones. At the top of the stairs, I slammed into a closed door at the end of the hallway. My fingers fumbled against the handle, turning it just as the whispering reached its peak. One word echoing louder than the rest. Stay. The door flew open, and I fell through. I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs as I hit the wooden floor. The door slammed shut behind me, and the whispering stopped. Silence dropped over the room like a weight. I pushed myself upright, coughing as I looked around. It was an attic. The ceiling sloped low, the wooden beams exposed and splintered. Old boxes and trunks were stacked haphazardly along the walls, their lids cracked open, spilling yellowed papers and faded photographs onto the floor. A single window sat at the far end, cracked and streaked with grime, the faint light of the moon seeping through. In the center of the room stood a mirror. It was tall and ornate, its frame carved with twisting patterns that looked like vines or roots. The glass was dark, too dark, like the surface of water just before it pulls you under. I stepped closer. My reflection appeared, but something was wrong. The version of me in the mirror wasn't moving. It stood perfectly still, staring back at me with wide, glassy eyes. Its mouth twitched, pulling into the faintest hint of a smile, and then its head tilted to the side in that same unnatural way. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking as the reflection stepped forward. The glass didn't break. It didn't shatter. It rippled, soft and slow, like water, as the figure in the mirror pushed through. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and broken, its face wearing my features but not my expression. It grinned at me, its teeth too sharp, too white, its eyes black pits that seemed to stretch endlessly. It whispered in my voice, soft and hollow, "You shouldn't have come here." The light flickered and went out. The darkness pressed in, suffocating and absolute, as though the room itself had swallowed the light. I couldn't see anything, not the mirror, not the warped floor beneath me, only blackness stretching in every direction. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, echoing off unseen walls. I felt unmoored, weightless, like I might drift away if I wasn't careful. Then, a sound. Faint at first, a slow, wet drip, drip. Each drop hit the floor with deliberate precision, the sound slicing through the silence like a blade. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing, to convince myself it was just water, a leak in the rotting ceiling above me. But I knew better. I fumbled with the flashlight in my hands, my fingers numb and shaking as I clicked the switch. Nothing. I shook it desperately, the casing rattling as though something inside had broken. Drip. Dot. Drip. Tight. The noise was louder now, closer. I'd feel it just behind me, at the edges of the dark, where the silence waited to pounce. I spun around, blind and frantic, my boots scraping against the splintered wood. The flashlight sputtered suddenly, its beam flickering weakly to life. The attic came back into view, the beam cutting through a thin haze of dust that hung in the air like smoke. I froze. The mirror was still there, looming at the center of the room. Its surface was no longer still. The glass rippled like liquid, tiny waves spreading outward from where I had last seen the thing that wore my face. But now, the surface was empty. My reflection was gone. The light sputtered again, and my pulse stuttered with it. I scanned the room, my breathing ragged. The boxes stacked against the walls seemed closer now, their shadows deeper, stretching long across the floorboards like they were reaching for me. I turned back toward the mirror. A hand pressed against the inside of the glass. It appeared out of nowhere, thin, pale fingers splayed wide, the skin cracked and gray like something long dead. I stumbled backward, the flashlight beam trembling as I pointed it at the mirror. The hand pushed harder, the surface of the glass bending beneath its weight like elastic. Cracks, spiderwebbed outward with a sharp pop, 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 dot-a-dot-o. It was coming through. I didn't wait to see it happen. I bolted for the attic door, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand as I ran. The floor groaned beneath my weight, boards shifting and sagging like they might give way at any second. Behind me I heard it, the splintering of glass, a wet, slithering sound like something dragging itself free. The door was stuck. I grabbed the handle and yanked it hard, my hands slick with sweat, my chest heaving. The whispers began again, rising from all around me. A chorus of voices repeating the same word over and over. Stay, 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 The door burst open, and I stumbled forward into the hallway. I slammed it shut behind me, my back pressing against the wood as I gasped for air. My flashlight's beam jittered across the walls, the shadows warping and bending as though alive. The whispers didn't stop. They echoed through the house now, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floor beneath my feet. I couldn't tell where they were coming from anymore, only that they were getting louder. I turned to run. The hallway stretched on endlessly in both directions, far longer than it had been when I first climbed the stairs. Doors lined the walls, each one identical, their handles rusted, the paint peeling in thin curling strips. At the far end, I could see the faint outline of something, a shape moving slowly toward me, its limbs jerking in awkward, unnatural angles. I didn't wait. I bolted the other way, the flashlight's beam bouncing across the walls as I ran. My boots pounded against the floor, the sound swallowed by the whispers that grew louder with every step. My heart felt like it would explode. The hallway twisted suddenly, and I skidded around a corner, nearly crashing into another door, a large, ornate thing that looked far older than the rest. Unlike the others, it was untouched by decay. The wood was polished, the brass handle gleaming faintly in the flickering light. It felt wrong. Too perfect. The whispers stopped. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The house was silent now, so quiet it hurt my ears. I glanced over my shoulder, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of the figure I'd seen before, crawling slowly around the far corner. It was closer now. Too close. I turned the handle and shoved the door open. Inside was darkness, thick and heavy, like ink. I stepped through before I could stop myself, the door swinging shut behind me with a dull final thud. The flashlight flickered as I lifted it, the beam struggling to cut through the dark. The room was massive, far larger than it should have been, its ceiling lost somewhere above me. Rows of wooden pews stretched out in neat, uniform lines, their surfaces slick with dust. At the far end of the room, an altar stood beneath a massive, stained glass window. The glass was black now, its patterns twisted into something jagged and unrecognizable. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I moved closer, the air thick and freezing. Something stood at the altar. It was hunched over, its back to me, its silhouette almost human but wrong. Its shoulders jutted out at sharp angles, its arms too long, its head lolling to the side as though it were broken. My breath caught in my throat as I edged closer, my boots dragging across the dusty floor. "Hello? Oh?" I whispered. The figure twitched. Slowly, its head turned, and I saw its face. No, my face, stretched and distorted, its mouth pulled into that same jagged grin. Its hollow eyes stared through me, black and endless, and it whispered in a voice that scraped against my ears like rusted metal. "You shouldn't have come here." The flashlight sputtered out. Darkness swallowed me whole. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the air like a storm. I stumbled back, the ground shifting beneath my feet, my hands outstretched to steady myself. My fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, a mirror. The glass was liquid beneath my touch, rippling outward. The whispers rose into a deafening roar, and the last thing I heard before the dark consumed me was my own voice, whispering softly in my ear, "Stay." The darkness was suffocating, pressing against my skin like damp cloth. I couldn't see, couldn't hear anything beyond the faint thrum of blood pounding in my ears. My feet scraped across the uneven floor as I staggered forward, hands outstretched, searching for something, anything, to ground me. The whispers were gone, replaced by a silence that felt worse. It wasn't empty. It was alive, full of something I couldn't name. My fingers brushed against the smooth, cold surface of a wall. Stone, maybe. The texture was strange, slick, like it had been sweating in the dark. Then a sound, a low, hollow creak, coming from somewhere ahead. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. The air felt heavier now, thick with a damp chill that settled into my lungs with every breath. I turned the flashlight in my hands, shaking it once, twice, until it flickered back to life. The beam cut through the dark, and I found myself standing in a long, narrow hallway. The walls were lined with mirrors. Each mirror was different, some cracked, their glass splintered into jagged patterns like spider webs. Others were pristine, their frames carved with twisting vines and strange symbols I didn't recognize. The mirrors stretched on endlessly, disappearing into the gloom, their reflections dancing uneasily in the flickering light. I took a step forward, and the sound of my boots echoed strangely, too loud against the silence. My reflection moved with me, its outline sharp and clear in the nearest mirror. But something about it was wrong. It wasn't immediate, but as I stared at it, I noticed the details. The way its mouth twitched at the corners, the slight delay in its movements, like it was mimicking me instead of reflecting. I turned away quickly, my heart thudding against my ribs. "Don't look at them," I told myself. "Just keep moving." The hallway seemed endless. My flashlight flickered with every step, the beam growing weaker, the air colder. The mirrors lined both sides, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all filled with reflections that weren't quite right. Some were too tall. Some were too thin. In one, I could have sworn I saw myself standing still while I kept walking. Then I saw it. A shape in the mirror, not me, just behind my shoulder, moving closer. I spun around, the flashlight beam slashing through the dark. The hallway behind me was empty, but the mirror still held the shadow, a tall, thin figure with its head bent at an unnatural angle, its arms stretched too long, fingers trailing like sharp wires. My breath caught as the figure stepped closer. Inside the glass, its face came into focus, smooth, pale, and featureless except for the mouth, grinning, sharp and jagged. I stumbled backward, the beam shaking violently. The figure didn't move, but the reflection rippled like water, distorting everything around it. I turned and ran, my boots slamming against the ground, each step echoing louder and louder, like the house itself was chasing me. The mirrors reflected flashes of me as I passed, distorted, laughing, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. I didn't stop. I didn't look. I just ran until the hallway ended and I crashed into a heavy wooden door. I shoved it open and stumbled inside, slamming it behind me. My flashlight flickered and went out. The room was dark and silent. I leaned against the door, chest heaving, my palms slick with sweat. The only sound was the faint drip of water somewhere far off, as though the house itself was still alive, still moving. I fumbled for the flashlight again, clicking it until the beam flared weakly to life. The light revealed the space around me, another room, but different. Larger. I was standing in what looked like a chapel. Wooden pews stretched out in neat rows, their surfaces warped and rotting, as though they'd been left to decay for centuries. At the far end of the room stood an altar, its edges carved with strange symbols identical to those on the mirrors. Above it hung a massive stained glass window. The glass was shattered. Where light should have spilled in, there was only darkness beyond. Something moved in that darkness, shadows shifting like oil pooling against the edges of the frame. The beam of my flashlight wavered as I stepped forward, the floor creaking loudly beneath me. As I approached the altar, I saw it. A book. It was massive, its leather cover cracked and blackened, edges curling like it had been burned. The symbols etched into its surface seemed to shift when I looked at them, twisting into patterns that made my head ache. I reached for it, hesitating just inches from the cover. The air felt colder here, heavier, as though the room were holding its breath. I didn't want to touch it. Then I heard the voice. "Read it." The whisper came from everywhere at once, curling through the air like smoke, soft and sickly sweet. I turned sharply, scanning the dark corners of the room, but I was alone. The voice came again, closer this time. "Read it." I looked back at the book. My hands moved on their own, shaking as they closed around the edges of the cover. The leather was cold against my skin, wet, like it was still alive. I opened it slowly, the spine groaning, the pages brittle and stained with dark streaks that looked too much like blood. The symbols filled the pages, jagged lines and circles, twisting into impossible shapes that seemed to sink into the paper itself. As I stared at them, they began to move. They crawled across the pages, shifting like insects scattering beneath a stone. I couldn't stop reading. The words poured into me, words I couldn't understand but felt somewhere deep inside, like they had been waiting for me to find them. My head throbbed, my vision blurring, but I kept reading. The voice grew louder, whispering the words alongside me. "Bring it back. Open the way." The shadows in the broken window began to move. I could feel them seeping into the room, coiling along the walls, stretching toward me like fingers. The symbols on the pages burned brighter, the black ink glowing faintly red. The ground beneath me shifted, and I looked up. The figure from the mirror was standing at the far end of the chapel, its grin stretching impossibly wide, its hollow eyes fixed on me. The voice spoke one last time, soft and final. "It's time." The stained glass window shattered. A wave of darkness poured through, slamming into me with the force of a hurricane. I was thrown backward, the book flying from my hands as the air turned cold and sharp. The room roared with sound, whispers, screams, the groaning of the house as the shadows flooded in. And then, silence. I opened my eyes slowly, gasping for breath. I was lying on the cold, damp floor of the chapel, the broken window stretching high above me. The book was gone. The shadows were gone. But I wasn't alone. The figure was standing just feet away now, its grin splitting wider, its head tilted as it whispered softly, "Welcome home." The figure didn't move. It stood there, silhouetted against the jagged shards of the broken window, its head tilted just enough to make it wrong. Its grin was carved across its face, splitting impossibly wide, as though the skin would tear at any second. I wanted to scream, to bolt toward the door, to force my legs to obey, but I couldn't move. I was frozen beneath that hollow, endless stare. Welcome home. The words echoed in my mind like a bell tolling in an empty room, soft but final. The figure took a step toward me. It didn't walk. It slid forward, its movements jerky and wrong, like a puppet whose strings had been pulled by unsure hands. Its shadow stretched long across the floor, the edges bleeding into the cracks in the wood, as though it wasn't just darkness, but something alive. I pushed myself upright, the chill of the floor biting through my palms, and stumbled backward. My hands hit the nearest pew, the rotted wood snapping under my weight. The sound was sharp in the silence, and for a moment, the figure stopped. Its head snapped upright, almost too quickly, and the grin widened further, if that was even possible. The room began to tremble. The walls groaned as though something massive and ancient was shifting just beyond them. I could hear it, the low, resonant sound of breathing, a slow, rhythmic exhale, like the house itself was alive, and I had disturbed it. "Get out," I whispered to myself, forcing my legs to move. I turned and bolted. My boots skidded across the wooden floor, sending up clouds of dust as I sprinted toward the door. The whispers rose again, their chorus wrapping around me like invisible hands, clawing at my skin. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just ran. The door was further than I remembered, like the room had stretched itself while I wasn't looking. My pulse roared in my ears, my chest burning with each gasping breath. Behind me, I heard it, footsteps. Not the heavy thud of someone running, but a soft, wet slapping sound, like bare feet dragging across stone. It was close. Too close. The door loomed ahead, its surface warped and splintered. I reached for the handle, my fingers stretching out. A hand gripped my shoulder. It wasn't a hand. It was cold and brittle, like bone wrapped in damp paper, its fingers impossibly long, curling against my skin. I screamed and wrenched myself free, spinning around, the flashlight flickering weakly as I swung it wildly. The figure was inches from me now. Its face, my face, was pale and smooth, its eyes nothing but black holes that stretched endlessly inward. It tilted its head again, that broken, unnatural movement, and whispered in my voice, "You can't leave." The floor beneath me splintered. A fissure spread outward from where the figure stood, jagged cracks splitting through the wood like lightning. Darkness bubbled up through the cracks, thick and oily, spreading like ink across the floor. The chapel shook violently. The pews toppled, the walls shuddering as if something was clawing at them from the other side. A deafening groan filled the air, the sound vibrating through my bones. I staggered backward, my flashlight falling from my hands as the ground shifted beneath me. The figure's shadow began to melt. It bled outward, stretching in every direction, creeping along the floor and up the walls. I turned and ran again, my feet slipping as the floor sagged beneath me, the cracks spreading faster. I threw my weight against the door, and it burst open with a sound like breaking glass. I stumbled into the hallway, collapsing to my knees as the door slammed shut behind me. My hands shook violently as I pushed myself up, gasping for air. The whispers were gone. The tremors had stopped, but the house was different now. The hallway was longer, the walls warped and swollen as though the house itself was breathing. The wallpaper had begun to peel away in strips, revealing something beneath, dark, pulsing veins that throbbed faintly with every heartbeat I took. I ran my hand along the wall, expecting wood plaster, but the surface was warm. I snatched my hand back and staggered forward, my only thought to find a way out. The hallway stretched endlessly, each door identical to the last. I passed them quickly, my breath catching in my throat as I heard faint sounds behind them. Soft crying, distant scratching, the low hum of something alive but unseen. Then I saw the door at the end of the hall. It was different, taller, older. Its surface was carved with the same symbols I'd seen in the chapel and on the book, twisting and looping like they'd been burned into the wood. A faint red light seeped through the cracks around the frame, pulsing like a heartbeat. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around, to run, to find another way. But something pulled me toward it, an invisible hand pressing against my back, pushing me forward. I gripped the handle. It was ice cold, sending a jolt up my arm that made my teeth ache. I turned it slowly, the door creaking open on its own, revealing a stairwell that spiraled downward into the dark. The red light came from somewhere far below, casting faint shadows across the walls. The air that rose up to meet me was damp and sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of rot and something metallic. I looked over my shoulder one last time. The hallway was gone. There was nothing behind me but blackness. With nowhere else to go, I stepped onto the first stair. The wood groaned beneath my weight, and I froze, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I took another step, then another. The whispers began again, rising up from the depths. Soft and distant at first, but growing louder with every step I took until they surrounded me, repeating the same word over and over. Down, down, down. The stairs spiraled endlessly, the red light glowing brighter as I descended. My hands brushed against the walls for balance, and I felt it again, that pulsing warmth, the veins beneath the surface moving faintly, like they were alive. Finally, I reached the bottom. I stepped into a cavernous room, its ceiling lost to shadow. The walls were slick and black, pulsing with the same red light that emanated from the center of the room. There, in a massive pit carved into the stone, lay something I couldn't fully comprehend. A shape, shifting and writhing, endless and impossible. It turned toward me, and in that moment, I understood. The house hadn't called me here. It had. It had been waiting. The thing in the pit was breathing. Each slow exhale shuddered through the cavern, rattling the walls and vibrating in my chest like a drumbeat. I couldn't see all of it, couldn't comprehend its full shape, but the parts I could see were enough. It moved like liquid, its surface shifting and writhing in constant, unnatural motion. Dark tendrils slithered across the stone floor, pulsating faintly as they reached outward, searching. The red light poured from its center, throbbing in time with the deep echoing hum that filled the air. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. My body refused to obey me. The cavern stretched around us like a cathedral, its walls slick and black, covered in jagged carvings that seemed to shimmer in the pulsing glow. The symbols I'd seen before, the ones in the chapel, on the book, covered every inch of stone, glowing faintly as though they were alive. The thing shifted again, and a sound escaped from deep within it, a low, rumbling growl that sent a chill down my spine. My breath hitched, my knees threatening to buckle as the weight of it pressed down on me. I could feel it in my bones, in my skull, like it was burrowing into my mind. It knows I'm here. The thought burned through me like fire, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. I needed to move. I needed to get out. But the cavern seemed to stretch endlessly, and the red light made the shadows dance in strange patterns, like they were alive. Then I heard it, a voice. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, low and soft, curling around me like smoke. Evelyn. I flinched, my name echoing off the cavern walls. I tried to move backward, but my feet wouldn't budge. The stone floor felt like it had melted beneath me, rooting me in place. You've come so far. The voice didn't sound human. It was too deep, too smooth, like 1,000 whispers speaking at once. My name slid from its mouth with unnatural familiarity, as though it had been waiting for me all along. The tendrils moved closer. One of them slithered across the floor, stopping just inches from my boots. It hovered there, twitching faintly, before it began to rise. I watched in horrified silence as it stretched upward, twisting and coiling until it formed a shape. A hand. Long, spindly fingers curled slowly, beckoning me forward. "Come closer." I shook my head, a choked noise escaping my throat. "No." The voice hummed, a low vibration that made the air tremble. The hand twitched, its blackened surface rippling like oil on water. "You don't have a choice." A scream rose in my chest, but before I could make a sound, the cavern shifted. The walls groaned, the cymbals pulsing brighter, and the ground beneath me moved. The stone rippled like liquid, waves spreading outward as the red light flared violently. The tendril hand shot forward, wrapping around my ankle. Cold. It was so cold. The touch burned like ice, spreading up my leg as I screamed and kicked at it. My boot connected with the tendril, and it shattered, pieces of it splintering into the air like shards of glass. The hum faltered, the cavern trembling as though the thing in the pit had recoiled. I didn't wait. My body was moving, before I'd even processed it, my legs dragging me backward, toward a narrow gap in the wall I hadn't noticed before. The opening was jagged and uneven, barely wide enough to squeeze through, but it was there. My only way out. Behind me, the rumbling grew louder. The red light flared, and I could feel it. The thing rising from the pit, stretching toward me. A sound filled the air, shrill and high-pitched, like the screech of metal being torn apart. "You cannot leave." I didn't stop. I dove for the gap, my shoulder slamming into the stone as I forced myself through. The rock scraped against my skin, tearing fabric and flesh, but I didn't care. I clawed my way forward, the tunnel closing in around me, the hum vibrating through the walls like it was alive. The gap twisted and turned, narrowing so tightly I thought I might get stuck. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, my hands slipping against the damp stone as I pulled myself forward. The red light still pulsed behind me, growing dimmer with every inch I put between myself and the cavern. And then, finally, I saw it, a faint sliver of darkness up ahead. An exit. I dragged myself through the last stretch of the tunnel, the rock scraping against my ribs, and tumbled out onto solid ground. The air was different here, cold and sharp, filled with the scent of rain and earth. I rolled onto my back, gasping for breath, as the tunnel behind me sealed itself with a sound like a thunderclap. I was outside. The sky above me was a flat, endless black, dotted with pinpricks of light that didn't look like stars. The ground beneath me was soft and uneven, covered in damp grass that seemed to pulse faintly, like it was breathing. I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, my body trembling as I looked around. I wasn't in the forest. Not anymore. The house stood in front of me, its silhouette sharper now, more jagged against the unnatural sky. It looked wrong, like the angles of it didn't line up, the edges stretching too far, twisting into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The windows were lit from within, their glow a deep, pulsing red that matched the light I'd seen in the cavern. Something was waiting for me inside. I could feel it pulling me forward, an invisible thread tightening around my chest, dragging me toward the front door. I didn't want to go, but there was nowhere else to run. The forest was gone, the land around me stretching into an empty void, endless and flat. The door was open, just a crack, spilling that same red light across the steps. I staggered toward it, my legs weak beneath me, my breath shallow as I reached the threshold. From somewhere deep inside the house, I heard a sound, soft and distant, like laughter echoing through empty halls. And then the voice came again, quiet this time, almost gentle. "Welcome back, Evelyn." The door yawned wide as I stepped inside, the red light swallowing me whole. It pulsed through the air, thick and heavy like fog, pressing against my skin, filling my lungs. The silence here was different, dense, alive, like it was waiting for something. For me. The house had changed again. The walls stretched higher, their edges jagged and uneven, and the hallway ahead of me seemed endless, bleeding into the dark. The light pooled in strange patterns across the floor, as though it couldn't decide which direction to go. I moved forward, my boots scraping softly against the warped wood. With each step, the air grew colder, the sound of my breathing too loud in my ears. I could feel the house watching me now, its presence pressing down on me from every direction. A door slammed somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed through the house like a gunshot, sharp and final. I stopped walking, my body rigid, every nerve on edge. The hallway was empty, but the shadows shifted at the corners of my vision, crawling along the walls like insects. "Come," the voice whispered. It was faint, carried through the air like a breeze, curling around me, slipping into my ears and under my skin. It wasn't coming from a direction I could follow. It was everywhere, buried in the walls, in the floors, inside me. "Where are you?" I choked out, my voice hoarse, cracking against the silence. The house answered. The hallway began to stretch, the floorboards groaning as the walls warped and twisted. I staggered, disoriented, as the corridor tilted beneath my feet. Doors slammed open on either side of me, one after another, bang, bang, the sound echoing endlessly. From inside those rooms, something moved, but I couldn't see it. I didn't want to see it. I ran. The hallway twisted and turned, folding in on itself like a maze. The light flickered wildly now, red and black bleeding together, until I couldn't tell where the floor ended and the walls began. My breath came in sharp bursts, my chest aching as I sprinted towards something, an opening ahead, a doorway bathed in a brighter glow, the only way forward. I burst through it and stumbled into the grand entryway of the house. The chandelier hung above me, its crystals warped and dripping with something thick and dark. The front door stood across the room, wide open now, the black void of the outside stretching beyond it. For a moment, hope flared in my chest, sharp and bright. I ran for it. The light shifted. The door snapped shut with a sound like cracking bones, the walls around it rippling and sealing it into place. The hope died as quickly as it had come. I stopped short, my shoulders rising and falling with each breath, and turned around. The figure was there. It stood at the base of the staircase, its shadow stretching impossibly far across the floor, the edges curling upward like smoke. Its head tilted in that same unnatural way, and when it smiled, I could feel the grin cut through the air like a knife. "You brought yourself here," it said in my voice, hollow and broken. "No," I whispered, my throat dry. "No, I didn't." The figure raised a hand, long bony fingers that twitched slightly as it pointed toward me. The air in the room shifted. The walls groaned, and the red light flared brighter, painting everything in its sickly glow. I could feel something beneath me, something massive, moving just below the surface of the house, breathing in time with the pulse of the light. "You don't remember," it said softly. The walls rippled, and images began to take shape, faint at first, like shadows, then sharper. I saw myself, standing in this very room, holding something in my hands. A book. The book. The memory slammed into me like a wave. I saw myself reading from its pages, the words crawling across the paper like insects, spilling from my mouth even though I didn't understand them. The ground split open. The red light poured through. The house breathed. I gasped, shaking my head. I didn't know. The figure stepped closer, its movement slow and deliberate, its shadow reaching for me like outstretched arms. "You opened the way," it whispered, "and now you must finish it." The ground beneath me cracked, jagged lines spreading outward as the floor split open, revealing the same chasm I'd seen before, the pit where the thing writhed and waited. Tendrils rose from the darkness, reaching for me, curling around my ankles. I screamed, stumbling backward, my hands scrabbling against the splitting wood as the floor gave way beneath me. "Let me go," I shouted, tears burning my eyes. The figure loomed over me now, its face inches from mine. I could see the darkness inside it, an emptiness that stretched forever. It smiled, and I felt my chest tighten as it whispered one final time. "You are the key." The tendrils tightened, and I fell. The world dropped away, and I tumbled into the darkness, the red light burning behind my eyelids. My screams echoed into nothingness, swallowed by the void as the hum returned, deafening, endless. I hit the ground hard. I opened my eyes and found myself lying on cold, damp stone. I was back in the cavern, the pit yawning wide in front of me, the tendrils rising and falling like waves. The figure was gone, but its voice lingered, whispering softly in the back of my mind. "Finish it." The book sat at the edge of the pit, open, tight, waiting. I crawled toward it, my body shaking, my vision blurring with tears and exhaustion. The hum rattled through my skull, vibrating in my bones, growing louder with every inch I moved closer. My hands closed around the book's edges, the leather slick and wet beneath my fingers. I knew what I had to do. The words rose from the pages, black ink shifting and twisting as they etched themselves into my mind. I spoke them aloud, my voice trembling at first, then stronger as the hum roared around me. The cavern shook, the tendrils writhing violently, the red light flaring brighter than ever before. The thing in the pit screamed. The sound split through me like a blade, but I didn't stop. I read the words, forcing them out through gritted teeth, as the cavern collapsed around me, stone and dust raining down in torrents. The red light flickered, dimming as the pit began to close, the tendrils retreating into the void. The hum stopped. Silence fell, heavy and absolute. I opened my eyes and found myself alone. The cavern was gone. The house was gone. I was lying in the middle of the forest, the ground cold and wet beneath me, the night sky stretched endlessly above. I pushed myself upright, my body aching, my hands stained with black ink. The house was nowhere to be seen. There was nothing but trees and darkness, and the faint, distant sound of the wind. It was over. At least that's what I told myself. I stood, my legs unsteady, and started walking. The forest was quiet now, but as I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, just out of sight, watching me, waiting. And in the distance, carried on the breeze, I heard it. A whisper. "Welcome home."